The Life of Moses Maimonides by Michael Friedlander in his 1904 translation of the Guide for the read by Daniel Davison. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Before the sun of Eli had set, the son of Samuel had risen. Before the voice of the prophets had ceased to guide the people, the interpreters of the law, the doctors of the Talmud, had commenced their labors, and before the academies of Sura and of Pumbedita were closed, centers of Jewish thought and learning were already flourishing in the far west. The circumstances which led to the transference of the headquarters of Jewish learning from the east to the west in the 10th century are thus narrated in the Sefer HaKabbalah of Rabbi Abraham ben David. After the death of Hezekiah, the head of the academy and prince of the exile, the academies were closed, and no new Geonim were appointed. But long before that time, heaven had willed that there should be a discontinuance of the pecuniary gifts which used to be sent from Palestine, North Africa, and Europe. Heaven had also decreed that a ship sailing from Bari should be captured by Ibn Rumahis, commander of the naval forces of Abdurrahman an-Nasr. 4 distinguished rabbis were thus made prisoners: Rabbi Hosheel, father of Rabbi Hananiel; Rabbi Moses, father of Rabbi Chanuk; Rabbi Shemaryahu, son of Rabbi Elchanan, and a 4th whose name has not been recorded. They were engaged in a mission to collect subsidies in aid of the academy in Sura. The captor sold them as slaves. Rabbi Hosheel was carried to Kairouan, Rabbi Shemaryahu was left in Alexandria, and Rabbi Moses was brought to Cordova. These slaves were ransomed by their brethren and were soon placed in important positions. When Rabbi Moses was brought to Cordova, it was supposed that he was uneducated. In that city there was a synagogue known at that time by the name of Knesset HaMidrash, and Rabbi Nathan, renowned for his great piety, was the head of the congregation. The members of the community used to hold meetings at which the Talmud was read and discussed. One day when Rabbi Nathan was expounding the Talmud and was unable to give a satisfactory explanation of the passage under consideration, Rabbi Moses promptly removed the difficulty and at the same time answered several questions which were submitted to him. Thereupon Rabbi Nathan thus addressed the assembly: "I am no longer your leader. That stranger in sackcloth shall henceforth be my teacher, and you shall appoint him to be your chief." The admiral, on hearing of the high attainments of his prisoner, desired to revoke the sale, but the king would not permit this retraction, being pleased to learn that his Jewish subjects were no longer dependent for their religious instruction on the schools in the East. Henceforth, the schools in the West asserted their independence and even surpassed the parent institutions. The caliphs, mostly opulent, gave every encouragement to philosophy and poetry, and being generally liberal in sentiment, they entertained kindly feelings towards their Jewish subjects. These were allowed to compete for the acquisition of wealth and honor on equal terms with their Mohammedan fellow citizens. Philosophy and poetry were consequently cultivated by the Jews with the same zest as by the Arabs. Ibn Gabirol, Ibn Chassadai, Yudah Halevi, Hananiel, Elphazi, the Ibn Ezras, and others who flourished in that period were the ornament of their age and the pride of the Jews at all times. The same favorable condition was maintained during the reign of the Umayyads. But when the Moravids and the Almowahids came to power, the horizon darkened once more, and misfortunes threatened to destroy the fruit of several centuries. Amidst this gloom there appeared a brilliant luminary, which sent forth rays of light and comfort. This was Moses Maimonides. Moses, the son of Maimon, was born at Cordova on the 14th of Nisan, 4895, March 30, 1135. Although the date of his birth has been recorded with the utmost accuracy, no trustworthy notice has been preserved concerning the early period of his life. But this entire career is a proof that he did not pass his youth in idleness. His education must have been in harmony with the hope of his parents that one day he would, like his father and forefathers, hold the honorable office of Dayan or Rabbi and distinguish himself in theological learning. It is probable that the Bible and the Talmud formed the chief subjects of his study, but he unquestionably made the best use of the opportunities which Mohammedan Spain and especially Cordova afforded him for the acquisition of general knowledge. It is not mentioned in any of his writings who were his teachers. His father, as it seems, was his principal guide and instructor in many branches of knowledge. David Conforte, in his historical work, Kore ha-Dorot, states that Maimonides was the pupil of two eminent men, namely Rabbi Yosef ibn Megash and Ibn Rushd of Aroez, that by the former he was instructed in the Talmud and by the latter in philosophy. This statement seems to be erroneous, as Maimonides was only a child at the time when Rabbi Yosef died, and already far advanced in years when he became acquainted with the writings of Ibn Rushd. The origin of this mistake, as regards Rabbi Yosef, can easily be traced. Maimonides, in his Mishnah Torah, employs in reference to Rabbi Isaac Alfasi and Rabbi Yosef the expression, "my teachers," Rabotai, and this expression, by which he merely describes his indebtedness to their writings, has been taken in its literal meaning. Whoever his teachers may have been, it is evident that he was well prepared by them for his future mission. At the age of 23, he entered upon his literary career with a treatise on the Jewish calendar. It is unknown where this work was composed, whether in Spain or in Africa. The author merely states that he wrote it at the request of a friend, whom he, however, leaves unnamed. The subject was generally considered to be very abstruse, and to involve a thorough knowledge of mathematics. Maimonides must therefore, even at this early period, have been regarded as a profound scholar by those who knew him. The treatise is of an elementary character. It was probably about the same time that he wrote in Arabic an explanation of logical terms, Milot Higayon, which Moses ibn Tebon translated into Hebrew. The earlier period of his life does not seem to have been marked by any incident worth noticing. It may, however, be easily conceived that the later period in his life, which was replete with interesting incidents, engaged the exclusive attention of his biographers. So much is certain, that his youth was beset with trouble and anxiety. The peaceful development of science and philosophy was disturbed by wars raging between Mohammedans and Christians, and also between the several Mohammedan sects. The Moravids, who had succeeded the Umayyads, were opposed to liberality and toleration, but they were surpassed in cruelty and fanaticism by their successors. Cordova was taken by the Almowahids in the year 1148, when Maimonides was about 13 years old. The victories of the Almowahids, first under the leadership of the Mahdi ibn Tamurt, and then under Abd al-Mu'min, were, according to all testimonies, attended by acts of excessive intolerance. Abd al-Mu'min would not suffer in his dominions any other faith but the one which he himself confessed. Jews and Christians had the choice between Islam and emigration or martyr's death. The Sefer ha-Kabbalah contains the following description of one of the persecutions which then occurred. After the death of Rabbi Yosef Halevi, the study of the Torah was interrupted, although he left a son and a nephew, both of whom had under his tuition become profound scholars. The righteous man, Rabbi Yosef, was taken away on account of the approaching evils. After the death of Rabbi Yosef, there came for the Jews a time of oppression and distress. They quitted their homes, such as were for death to death, and such as were for the sword to the sword, and such as were for the famine to the famine, and such as were for the captivity to the captivity. And it might be added, the words of Jeremiah 15:2, such as were for apostasy to apostasy. All this happened through the sword of Ibn Tamurt, who in 1142, determined to blot out the name of Israel and actually left no trace of the Jews in any part of his empire. Ibn Verga, in his work on Jewish martyrdom in Shebet Yehuda, gives the following account of events then happening. In the year 4902, the armies of Ibn Tamurt made their appearance. A proclamation was issued that anyone who refused to adopt Islam would be put to death, and his property would be confiscated. Thereupon the Jews assembled at the gate of the royal palace and implored the king for mercy. He answered, "It is because I have compassion on you that I command you to become Muslimim, for I desire to save you from eternal punishment." The Jews replied, "Our salvation depends on our observance of the divine law. You are the master of our bodies and of our property, but our souls will be judged by the king who gave them to us, and to whom they will return. Whatever be our future fate, you, O king, will not be held responsible for it." "I do not desire to argue with you," said the king, "for I know you will argue according to your own religion. It is my absolute will that you either adopt my religion or be put to death." The Jews then proposed to emigrate, but the king would not allow his subjects to serve another king. In vain did the Jews implore the nobles to intercede in their behalf. The king remained inexorable. Thus many congregations forsook their religion, but within a month the king came to a sudden death. The son, believing that his father had met with an untimely end as a punishment for his cruelty to the Jews, assured the involuntary converts that it would be indifferent to him what religion they professed. Hence many Jews returned at once to the religion of their fathers, while others hesitated for some time, from fear that the king meant to entrap the apparent converts. From such records it appears that during these calamities some of the Jews fled to foreign countries, some died as martyrs, and many others submitted for a time to outward conversion. Which course was followed by the family of Maimon? Did they sacrifice personal comfort and safety to their religious conviction, or did they, on the contrary, for the sake of mere worldly considerations, dissemble their faith and pretend that they completely submitted to the dictates of the tyrant? An answer to this question presents itself in the following note which Maimonides has appended to his commentary on the Mishnah. "I have now finished this work in accordance with my promise, and I fervently beseech the Almighty to save us from error. If there be one who shall discover an inaccuracy in this commentary, or shall have a better explanation to offer, let my attention be directed unto it, and let me be exonerated by the fact that I have worked with far greater application than any one who writes for the sake of pay and profit, and that I have worked under the most trying circumstances, for heaven had ordained that we be exiled, and we were therefore driven about from place to place. I was thus compelled to work at the commentary while traveling by land or crossing the sea. It might have sufficed to mention that during that time I, in addition, was engaged in other studies, but I preferred to give the above explanation in order to encourage those who wish to criticize or annotate the commentary, and at the same time to account for the slow progress of the work. I, Moses, the son of Maimon, commenced it when I was 23 years old, and finished it in Egypt at the age of 33 years, in the year 1479, Sel, 1168. The Sefer Charedim of Rabbi Eliezer Askari of Safed contains the following statement of Maimonides. On Sabbath evening, the 4th of Iyar, 4925, 1165, I went on board. On the following Sabbath, the waves threatened to destroy our lives. On the 3rd of Shivan, I arrived safely at Akko, and was thus rescued from apostasy. On Tuesday, the 4th of Mar Cheshvan, 4926, I left Akko, arrived at Jerusalem after a journey beset with difficulties and with dangers, and prayed on the spot of the great and holy house on the 4th, 5th, and 6th of Mar Cheshvan. On Sunday, the 9th of that month, I left Jerusalem and visited the cave of Machpelah in Hebron. From these two statements, it may be inferred that in times of persecution, Maimonides and his family did not seek to protect their lives and property by dissimulation. They submitted to the troubles of exile in order that they might remain faithful to their religion. Carmely, Geiger, Munk, and others are of opinion that the treatise of Maimonides on involuntary apostasy, as well as the accounts of some Mohammedan authors, contain strong evidence to show that there was a time when the family of Maimon publicly professed their belief in Muhammad. A critical examination of these documents compels us to reject their evidence as inadmissible. After a long period of trouble and anxiety, the family of Maimon arrived at Fustat in Egypt and settled there. David, the brother of Moses Maimonides, carried on a trade in precious stones, while Moses occupied himself with his studies and interested himself in the communal affairs of the Jews. It appears that for some time Moses was supported by his brother, and when his brother died, he earned a living by practicing as a physician. But he never sought or derived any benefit from his service to his community or from his correspondence or from the works he wrote for the instruction of his brethren. The satisfaction of being of service to his fellow creatures was for him a sufficient reward. The first public act in which Maimonides appears to have taken a leading part was a decree promulgated by the rabbinical authorities in Cairo in the year 1167. The decree begins as follows: "In times gone by, when storms and tempests threatened us, we used to wander about from place to place, but by the mercy of the Almighty we have now been enabled to find here a resting place. On our arrival we noticed to our great dismay that the learned were disunited, that none of them turned his attention to the needs of the congregation. We therefore felt it our duty to undertake the task of guiding the holy flock, of inquiring into the condition of the community, of reconciling the hearts of the fathers to their children, and of correcting the corrupt ways. The injuries are great, but we may succeed in effecting a cure, and in accordance with the words of the prophet, I will seek the lost one, and that which has been cast out I will bring back, and the broken one I will cure." Micah 4:6. When we therefore resolved to take the management of the communal affairs into our hands, we discovered the existence of a serious evil in the midst of the community, etc. It was probably about that time that Maimon died. Letters of condolence were sent to his son Moses from all sides, both from Mohammedan and from Christian countries. In some instances, the letters were several months on their way before they reached their destination. The interest which Maimonides now took in communal affairs did not prevent him from completing the great and arduous work, the commentary on the Mishnah, which he had begun in Spain and continued during his wanderings in Africa. In his commentary he proposed to give the quintessence of the Gemara, to expound the meaning of each dictum in the Mishnah, and to state which of the several opinions had received the sanction of the Talmudic authorities. His object in writing this work was to enable those who are not disposed to study the Gemara to understand the Mishnah and to facilitate the study of the Gemara for those who are willing to engage in it. The commentator generally adheres to the explanations given in the Gemara, and it is only in cases where the halakha, or practical law, is not affected that he ventures to dissent. He acknowledges the benefit he derived from such works of his predecessors as the halakot of Al-Fasi and the writings of the Geonim. But afterwards he asserted that errors which were discovered in his works arose from his implicit reliance on those authorities. His originality is conspicuous in the introduction and in the treatment of the general principles which in some instances precedes the exposition of an entire section or chapter, in others that of a single rule. The commentator is generally concise, except when occasion is afforded to treat of ethical and theological principles, or of a scientific subject such as weights and measures, or mathematical and astronomical problems. Although exhortations to virtue and warnings against vice are found in all parts of his work, they are especially abundant in the commentary on Abot, which is prefaced by a separate psychological treatise called The 8 Chapters. The dictum, "He who speaketh much commits a sin," elicited a lesson on the economy of speech. The explanation of the Olam Haba in the treatise Sanhedrin 11:1 led him to discuss the principles of faith and to lay down the 13 articles of the Jewish creed. The commentary was written in Arabic and was subsequently translated into Hebrew and into other languages. The estimation in which the commentary was held may be inferred from the following fact. When the Jews in Italy became acquainted with its method and spirit through a Hebrew translation of one of its parts, they sent to Spain in search of a complete Hebrew version of the commentary. Rabbi Shimcha, who had been entrusted with the mission, found no copy extant, but he succeeded through the influence of Rabbi Shelomo ben Adaret in causing a Hebrew translation of this important work to be prepared. In the introduction, the author states that he has written a commentary on the Babylonian Talmud treatise Chulin and on the nearly 3 entire sections, Videlichet, Moed, Neshim, and Nezikin. Of all these commentaries, only the one on Rosh Hashanah is known. In the year 1172, Maimonides wrote the Egeret Teman, or the Petach Tikva, Letters to the Jews in Yemen, or Opening of Hope, in response to a letter addressed to him by Rabbi Yaakov al-Fayoumi on the critical condition of the Jews in Yemen. Some of these Jews had been forced into apostasy. Others were made to believe that certain passages in the Bible alluded to the mission of Muhammad. Others again had been misled by an impostor who pretended to be the Messiah. The character and style of Maimonides' reply appear to have been adapted to the intellectual condition of the Jews in Yemen for whom it was written. These probably read the Bible with midrashic commentaries and preferred the easy and attractive Aggadah to the more earnest study of the Halakha. It is therefore not surprising that the letter contains remarks and interpretations which cannot be reconciled with the philosophical and logical method by which all the other works of Maimonides are distinguished. After a few complimentary words in which the author modestly disputes the justice of the praises lavished upon him, he attempts to prove that the present sufferings of the Jews, together with the numerous instances of apostasy, were foretold by the prophets, especially by Daniel, and must not perplex the faithful. It must be borne in mind, he continues, that the attempts made in past times to do away with the Jewish religion had invariably failed. The same would be the fate of the present attempts, for religious persecutions are of but short duration. The arguments which profess to demonstrate that in certain biblical passages allusion is made to Muhammad are based on interpretations which are totally opposed to common sense. He urges that the Jews, faithfully adhering to their religion, should impress their children with the greatness of the revelation on Mount Sinai and of the miracles wrought through Moses. They also should remain firm in the belief that God will send the Messiah to deliver their nation, but they must abandon futile calculations of the Messianic period and beware of impostors. Although there be signs which indicate the approach of the promised deliverance, and the time seem to be the period of the last and most cruel persecution mentioned in the visions of Daniel 11 and 12, the person in Yemen who pretends to be the Messiah is an impostor, and if care be not taken, he is sure to do mischief. Similar impostors in Cordova, France, and Africa have deceived the multitude and brought great troubles upon the Jews. Yet inconsistently with this sound advice, the author gives a positive date of the Messianic time on the basis of an old tradition. The inconsistency is so obvious that it is impossible to attribute this passage to Maimonides himself. It is probably spurious and has perhaps been added by the translator. With the exception of the rhymed introduction, the letter was written in Arabic, in order that all should be able to read and understand it. For that purpose, the author desires that copies should be made of it and circulated among the Jews. Rabbi Nahum of the Maghreb translated the letter into Hebrew. The success in the first great undertaking of explaining the Mishnah encouraged Maimonides to propose to himself another task of a still more ambitious character. In the commentary on the Mishnah, it was his object that those who were unable to read the Gemara should be made acquainted with the results obtained by the Amoraim in the course of their discussions on the Mishnah. But the Mishnah, with the commentary, was not such a code of laws as might easily be consulted in cases of emergency. Only the initiated would be able to find the section, the chapter, and the paragraph in which the desired information could be found. The Halakha had besides been further developed since the time when the Talmud was compiled. The changed state of things had suggested new questions. These were discussed and settled by the Geonim, whose decisions, being contained in special letters or treatises, were not generally accessible. Maimonides, therefore, undertook to compile a complete code which would contain, in the language and style of the Mishnah, and without discussion, the whole of the written and the oral law, all the precepts recorded in the Talmud, Sifra, Sifre, and the Tosefta, and the decisions of the Geonim. According to the plan of the author, this work was to present a solution of every question touching the religious, moral, or social duties of the Jews. It was not in any way his object to discourage the study of the Talmud and the Midrash. He only sought to diffuse a knowledge of the law amongst those who, through incapacity or other circumstances, were precluded from that study. In order to ensure the completeness of the code, the author drew up a list of the 613 precepts of the Pentateuch, divided them into 14 groups. These again he subdivided, and thus showed how many positive and negative precepts were contained in each section of the Mishneh Torah. The principles by which he was guided in this arrangement were laid down in a separate treatise called Sefer HaMitzvot. Works of a similar kind, written by his predecessors as the Halakot Gedolot of Rabbi Shimon Kahira and the several Azharot, were, according to Maimonides, full of errors because their authors had not adopted any proper method. But an examination of the rules laid down by Maimonides and of their application leads to the conclusion that his results were not less arbitrary, as has been shown by the criticisms of Nachmanides. The Sefer HaMitzvot was written in Arabic and thrice translated into Hebrew, namely by Rabbi Abraham ben Chisdai, Rabbi Shelomo ben Yosef ben Yob, and Rabbi Moses ibn Tabon. Maimonides himself desired to translate the book into Hebrew, but to his disappointment he found no time. This Sefer HaMitzvot was executed as a preparation for his principal work, the Mishneh Torah, or Yed HaChazaka, which consists of an introduction and 14 books. In the introduction, the author first describes the chain of tradition from Moses to the close of the Talmud, and then he explains his method in compiling the work. He distinguishes between the dicta found in the Talmud, Sifre, Sifra, or Tosefta on the one hand, and the dicta of the Geonim on the other. The former were binding on all Jews, the latter only as far as their necessity and their utility or the authority of their propounders was recognized. Having once for all stated the sources from which he compiled his work, he did not deem it necessary to name in each case the authority for his opinion or the particular passage from which he derived his dictum. Any addition of references to each paragraph he probably considered useless to the uninformed and superfluous to the learned. At a later time he discovered his error, he being himself unable to find again the sources of some of his decisions. Rabbi Yosef Karo, in his commentary on the Mishneh Torah, termed Keshef Mishneh, remedied this deficiency. The introduction is followed by the enumeration of the 613 precepts and a description of the plan of the work, its division into 14 books, and the division of the latter into sections, chapters, and paragraphs. According to the author, the Mishneh Torah is a mere compendium of the Talmud, but he found sufficient opportunities to display his real genius, his philosophical mind, and his ethical doctrines. For in stating what the traditional law enjoined, he had to exercise his own judgment, and to decide whether a certain dictum was meant to be taken literally or figuratively, whether it was the final decision of a majority or the rejected opinion of a minority, whether it was part of the oral law or precept founded on the scientific views of a particular author, and whether it was of universal application or was only intended for a special period or a special locality. The first book, Sefer HaMadda, is the embodiment of his own ethical and theological theories, although he frequently refers to the sayings of our sages and employs the phraseology of the Talmud. Similarly, the section on the Jewish calendar, Hilkot HaEbur, may be considered as his original work. In each group of the halakot, its source, a certain passage of the Pentateuch, is first quoted, with its traditional interpretation, and then the detailed rules follow in systematic order. The Mishneh Torah was written by the author in pure Hebrew. When subsequently a friend asked him to translate it into Arabic, he said he would prefer to have his Arabic writings translated into Hebrew instead of the reverse. The style is an imitation of the Mishnah. He did not choose, the author says, the philosophical style, because that would be unintelligible to the common reader, nor did he select the prophetic style, because that would not harmonize with the subject. 10 years of hard work by day and by night were spent in the compilation of this code, which had originally been undertaken for his own benefit to save him in his advanced age the trouble and the necessity of consulting the Talmud on every occasion. Maimonides knew very well that his work would meet with the opposition of those whose ignorance it would expose, also of those who were incapable of comprehending it, and of those who were inclined to condemn every deviation from their own preconceived notions. But he had the satisfaction to learn that it was well received in most of the congregations of Israel, and that there was a general desire to possess and study it. This success confirmed him in his hope that at a later time, when all cause for jealousy would have disappeared, the Mishneh Torah would be received by all Jews as an authoritative code. This hope has not been realized. The genius, earnestness, and zeal of Maimonides are generally recognized, but there is no absolute acceptance of his dicta. The more he insisted on his infallibility, the more did the rabbinical authorities examine his words and point out errors wherever they believed that they could discover any. It was not always from base motives, as contended by Maimonides and his followers, that his opinions were criticized and rejected. The language used by Rabbi Abraham ben David in his notes Hasagot on the Mishneh Torah appears harsh and disrespectful if read together with the text of the critical passage, but it seems tame and mild if compared with expressions used now and then by Maimonides about men who happen to hold opinions differing from his own. Maimonides received many complimentary letters congratulating him upon his success, but likewise letters with criticisms and questions respecting individual halakot. In most cases, he had no difficulty in defending his position. From the replies, it must, however, be inferred that Maimonides made some corrections and additions which were subsequently embodied in his work. The letters addressed to him on the Mishneh Torah and on other subjects were so numerous that he frequently complained of the time he had to spend in their perusal and of the annoyance they caused him. But he bore all this patiently, as he had learned in his youth to bear the yoke. He was not surprised that many misunderstood his words, for even the simple words of the Pentateuch, "The Lord is one," had met with the same fate. Some inferred from the fact that he treated fully the Olam Haba, the future state of the soul, and neglected to expatiate on the resurrection of the dead, that he altogether rejected that principle of faith. They therefore asked Rabbi Samuel Halevi of Baghdad to state his opinion. The rabbi accordingly discussed the subject, but, according to Maimonides, he attempted to solve the problem in a very unsatisfactory manner. The latter thereupon likewise wrote a treatise on the resurrection of the dead, in which he protested his adherence to this article of faith. He repeated the opinion he had stated in the commentary on the Mishnah and in the Mishneh Torah, but in more words, the same idea being reiterated in various forms, as the treatise was only intended for women and for the common multitude. These theological studies engrossed his attention to a great extent, but it did not occupy him exclusively. In a letter addressed to Rabbi Jonathan of Lunel, he says, "Although from my birth the Torah was betrothed to me, and continues to be loved by me as the wife of my youth, in whose love I find a constant delight, strange women, whom I at first took into my house as her handmaids, have become her rivals, and absorb a portion of my time." He devoted himself especially to the study of medicine, in which he distinguished himself to such a degree, according to Al-Kifli, that the king of the Franks in Ascalon wanted to appoint him as his physician. Maimonides declined the honor. Al-Fadl, the vizier of Saladin, king of Egypt, admired the genius of Maimonides and bestowed upon him many distinctions. The name of Maimonides was entered on the roll of physicians. He received a pension and was introduced to the court of Saladin. The method adopted in his professional practice he describes in a letter to his pupil Ibn Aknin as follows. You know how difficult this profession is for a conscientious and exact person who only states what he can support by argument or authority. This method is more fully described in a treatise on hygiene composed for Al-Fadl, the son of Saladin, who was suffering from a severe illness and had applied to Maimonides for advice. In a letter to Rabbi Samuel ibn Tabon, he alludes to the amount of time spent in his medical practice and says, I reside in Egypt, or Fustat. The king resides in Cairo, which lies about 2 Sabbath-day journeys from the first-named place. My duties to the king are very heavy. I am obliged to visit him every day early in the morning, and when he or any of his children or the inmates of his harem are indisposed, I dare not quit Cairo, but must stay during the greater part of the day in the palace. It also frequently happens that 1 or 2 of the royal officers fall sick, and then I have to attend them. As a rule, I go to Cairo very early in the day, and even if nothing unusual happens, I do not return before the afternoon, when I am almost dying with hunger. But I find the antechambers filled with Jews and Gentiles, with nobles and common people awaiting my return, etc. Notwithstanding these heavy professional duties of court physician, Maimonides continued his theological studies. After having compiled a religious guide, Mishneh Torah, based on revelation and tradition, he found it necessary to prove that the principles there set forth were confirmed by philosophy. This task he accomplished in his Dalalat al-Hayyarin, the Guide for the Perplexed, of which an analysis will be given below. It was composed in Arabic and written in Hebrew characters. Subsequently, it was translated into Hebrew by Rabbi Samuel ibn Tabon in the lifetime of Maimonides, who was consulted by the translator on all difficult passages. The congregation in Lunel, ignorant of Ibn Tabon's undertaking, or desirous to possess the most correct translation of the guide, addressed a very flattering letter to Maimonides, requesting him to translate the work into Hebrew. Maimonides replied that he could not do so, as he had not sufficient leisure for even more pressing work, and that a translation was being prepared by the ablest and fittest man, Rabbi Samuel ibn Tabon. A second translation was made later on by Yehuda al-Kharizi. The guide delighted many, but it also met with much adverse criticism on account of the peculiar views held by Maimonides concerning angels, prophecy, and miracles, especially on account of his assertion that if the Aristotelian proof for the eternity of the universe had satisfied him, he would have found no difficulty in reconciling the biblical account of the creation with that doctrine. The controversy on the guide continued long after the death of Maimonides to divide the community, and it is difficult to say how far the author's hope to effect a reconciliation between reason and revelation was realized. His disciple, Yosef ibn Aknin, to whom the work was dedicated and who was expected to derive from it the greatest benefit, appears to have been disappointed. His inability to reconcile the two antagonistic elements of faith and science he describes allegorically in the form of a letter addressed to Maimonides, in which the following passage occurs. Speak, for I desire that you be justified. If you can, answer me. Some time ago your beloved daughter, the beautiful and charming Kimma, obtained grace and favor in my sight, and I betrothed her unto me in faithfulness, and married her in accordance with the law, in the presence of 2 trustworthy witnesses, viz. Our master, Abdallah and Ibn Rushd. But she soon became faithless to me. She could not have found fault with me, yet she left me and departed from my tent. She does no longer let me behold her pleasant countenance, or hear her melodious voice. You have not rebuked or punished her, and perhaps you are the cause of this misconduct. Now send the wife back to the man, for he is, or might become, a prophet. He will pray for you that you may live, and also for her that she may be firm and steadfast. If, however, you do not send her back, the Lord will punish you. Therefore seek peace and pursue it. Listen to what our sages said. Blessed be he who restores to the owner his lost property. For this blessing applies in a higher degree to him who restores to a man his virtuous wife, the crown of her husband. Maimonides replied in the same strain, and reproached his son-in-law that he falsely accused his wife of faithlessness after he had neglected her, but he restored him his wife with the advice to be more cautious in the future. In another letter, Maimonides exhorts Ibn Aqnin to study his works, adding, "Apply yourself to the study of the law of Moses. Do not neglect it, but on the contrary, devote to it the best and the most of your time. And if you tell me that you do so, I am satisfied that you are on the right way to eternal bliss." Of the letters written after the completion of the guide, the one addressed to the wise men of Marseilles, 1194, is especially noteworthy. Maimonides was asked to give his opinion on astrology. He regretted in his reply that they were not yet in the possession of his Mishneh Torah. They would have found in it the answer to their question. According to his opinion, man should only believe what he can grasp with his intellectual faculties, or perceive by his senses, or what he can accept on trustworthy authority. Beyond this, nothing should be believed. Astrological statements not being founded on any of these three sources of knowledge must be rejected. He had himself studied astrology and was convinced that it was no science at all. If some dicta be found in the Talmud which appear to represent astrology as a true source of knowledge, these may either be referred to the rejected opinion of a small minority, or may have an allegorical meaning. But they are by no means forcible enough to set aside principles based on logical proof. The debility of which Maimonides so frequently complained in his correspondence gradually increased, and he died in his 70th year on the 20th of Tebeth, 4965, 1204. His death was the cause of great mourning to all Jews. In Fustat, a mourning of 3 days was kept. In Jerusalem, a fast was appointed. A portion of the Tochacha, Leviticus 26 or Deuteronomy 29, was read, and also the history of the capture of the ark by the Philistines, 1 Samuel 4. His remains were brought to Tiberias. The general regard in which Maimonides was held both by his contemporaries and by succeeding generations has been expressed in the popular saying, "From Moses to Moses, there was none like Moses." End of The Life of Moses Maimonides by Michael Friedlander. Read by Daniel Davison. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain.
Of the Effects of Opium in Lowness of Spirits by George Young, 1692 to 1757, from a treatise on opium, founded upon practical observations, published in 1753. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Section 22. Of the Effects of Opium in Lowness of Spirits. To some, opium gives a flow of spirits after once they are accustomed to it, and they find them proportionally depressed after its influence is over. I saw one physical patient who, by the exhilarating quality of opium, would sing songs and despise death. But ere 24 hours were elapsed, he would behave more like a true penitent. He fancied he was dying, and wanted the assistance of a clergyman. These two opposite characters he often alternately assumed, and when a clergyman could not be got, he was so miserable from excessive languor that he repeated his dose of opium before the usual time, which set his mind at ease before the other consolation could arrive. Mrs. C.D. died of a consumption after 15 months' illness. She used no opium till within 3 weeks of her death. Her diet had been cool and abstemious from the beginning, which probably preserved her so long, for she had been of a weakly disposition and a bad habit of body a great while. I found her pulse was slow and languid, and she complained of great lassitude, so that life became a burden to her. A dose of opium relieved her so much that she regretted she had not begun taking it sooner. She said it was a blessed medicine for the present relief it gave, though it should do no more good. When the effects of opium ceased, her languor returned, and the dose was renewed. Some advised her not to indulge herself in the use of opium. She answered that she would take it, though she was certain it would hasten her death. For it was better to have one easy death, if it could be had, than suffer an hundred of the miserable kind. For such she reckoned every fit of languor. Here I had a most evident instance of the power of opium in giving a flow of spirits when they were reduced to the lowest ebb. It was in the incurable stage of the disease, when advanced beyond all hopes, and when the cough seemed abated merely through a defect of the vis vitae. No wine or cordial would serve the purpose in the present case, because they disagreed with her stomach. Mrs. R. had been long accustomed to liquid laudanum, and took betwixt 300 and 400 drops a day. Without it she was greatly depressed with a kind of melancholy, and with it behaved like one in liquor, being very loquacious and apparently very happy. But the best proof we have of this property of opium is the effect it produces among the Turks. There a whole nation, or a great part of them, are accustomed to take opium freely. And when the practice is become habitual, it loses its soporific quality, and is used to give courage in the day of battle. If a long and confirmed habit of taking opium can divest it of its narcotic quality, it will probably be found a valuable drug, in some cases wherein it is often dangerous by being too apt to cause sleep. A certain surgeon always took some opium, and gave it likewise to his patient when he had any considerable operation to perform. But I must own that a glass of generous wine had always a better effect upon me when I wanted to excite courage. The reason why it might not succeed with me might be that I had not been accustomed to take it except when indisposed. And, as I hinted before, it is the habitual use of it that renders it ineffectual in promoting sleep. At least I can be positive that it does not give a flow of spirits to every one alike. And yet we are told that the Turks doubt no more of its power to exhilarate and give courage than we do of its soporific quality. I have at present one patient who has used it for 12 years. He never finds that it disposes him to sleep at all, though he takes 4 teaspoonfuls every day of the liquid laudanum. Some years ago a sailor came from the East Indies with a very ill habit of body, after drinking rack punch for some years. He had a large abscess in his thigh, which I was in hopes would have cured him. But after it broke, and had almost suffocated all in the room with the smell, he found his spirits in 2 days so depressed that he despaired of recovery. He told me that he perceived nature gradually sinking since the opening of the abscess, for which I gave him 25 drops of liquid laudanum. The next morning he told me he was in heaven, and indeed the change which that single dose had made upon him in one night was astonishing, for his lips and cheeks recovered their red color. His eyes, which before were sunk and lifeless, were now sparkling and brisk. This was a remarkable instance of the effect of opium in giving courage and curing a languor, or excessive weariness. He perfectly recovered without any other medicine, and became so much prejudiced in its favor that he swore it should go through the world with him, and naught but death should part them. Had he taken the opium while the suppuration was advancing, the inflammation and opium would have counteracted each other, the one tending to hinder, the other to promote sleep. The opium would have closed his eyes. Then immediately the inflammation would have made him moan till he awakened with a violent start out of a terrible dream. Thus he would have continued restless betwixt sleeping and waking. So different are the effects of opium in the same person under different circumstances. End of The Effects of Opium in Lowness of Spirits, by George Young, 1692 to 1757.
On the Federal Constitution, by Benjamin Franklin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Dale Grothman. On the Federal Constitution, by Benjamin Franklin. I confess that I do not entirely approve of this Constitution at present, but, sir, I am not sure I shall never approve of it, for, having lived long, I have experienced many instances of being obliged, by better information or fuller consideration, to change opinions even on important subjects, which once I thought right, but found to be otherwise. It is therefore that the older I grow, the more apt I am to doubt my own judgment of others. Most men, indeed, as well as most sects in religion, think themselves in possession of all truth, and that wherever others differ from them, it is so far error. Steele, a Protestant, in a dedication, tells the Pope that the only difference between our two churches in their opinions of the certainty of their doctrine is, the Romish Church is infallible, and the Church of England is never in the wrong. But though many private persons think almost as highly of their own infallibility as of that of their sect, few express it so naturally as a certain French lady, who, in a little dispute with her sister, said, "But I meet with nobody but myself that is always in the right." In these sentiments, sir, I agree to this Constitution with all its faults, if they are such, because I think a general government necessary for us, and there is no form of government but what may be a blessing to the people if well administered. And I believe further that it is likely to be well administered for a course of years, and can only end in despotism, as other forms have done before it, when the people become so corrupt as to need despotic government, being incapable of any other. I doubt, too, whether any other convention we may obtain may be able to make a better constitution. For, when you assemble a number of men to have the advantage of their joint wisdom, you inevitably assemble with those men all their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinion, their local interests, and their selfish views. From such an assembly can a perfect production be expected? It therefore astonishes me, sir, to find this system approaching so near to perfection as it does, and I think it will astonish our enemies, who are waiting with confidence to hear that our counsels are confounded like those of the builders of Babel, and that our states are on the point of separation, only to meet thereafter for the purpose of cutting one another's throats. Thus I consent, sir, to this Constitution, because I expect no better, and because I am not sure that it is not the best. The opinions I have had of its errors I sacrifice to the public good. I have never whispered a syllable of them abroad. Within these walls they were born, and here they shall die. If every one of us, in returning to our constituents, were to report the objections he has had to it, and endeavor to gain partisans in support of them, we might prevent its being generally received, and thereby lose all the salutary effects and great advantages resulting naturally in our favor among foreign nations, as well as among ourselves, from our real or apparent unanimity. Much of the strength and efficiency of any government in procuring and securing happiness to the people depends on opinion, on the general opinion of the goodness of that government, as well as the wisdom and integrity of its governors. I hope, therefore, for our own sakes, as a part of the people, and for the sake of our posterity, that we shall act heartily and unanimously in recommending this Constitution wherever our influence may extend, and turn our future thoughts and endeavors to the means of having it well administered. On the whole, sir, I cannot help expressing a wish that every member of the Convention who may still have objections to it would, with me on this occasion, doubt a little of his own infallibility, and, to make manifest our unanimity, put his name on this instrument. The end of On the Federal Constitution by Benjamin Franklin.
The Subways and Tunnels of New York, Methods and Costs by Gilbert H. Gilbert. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 2. The Original Hudson Tunnel. In 1871, D.C. Haskins conceived the idea of building a tunnel under the Hudson River. In making a trip from the Pacific coast via Omaha, he had been struck with the system of building piers for a railway bridge over the Missouri River. This system was the forming of a caissons made up of a number of iron rings bolted together and constituting a cylinder which could be lengthened by the addition of rings as the caisson descended. Airlocks and compressed air were used, the material within the caisson being excavated by hand till a bedrock foundation was reached. From a study of this work, Mr. Haskins conceived the idea that iron cylinders fitted with airlocks could be placed horizontally, and tubular tunnels under the Hudson River could be started from the bottom of a shaft by using compressed air to prevent the inflow of earth and water. As the material was excavated in front of the tunnel, the latter was to be advanced by the addition of rings of the diameter of the finished tube. Work on such a tunnel under the Hudson River to connect New Jersey and New York was commenced on the New Jersey side in November 1874. The bed of the Hudson is a silt deposit, which, when dry, is an impalpable powder, but when saturated with water is as fluid as quicksand. When a certain degree of moisture is carried by this material, it has a consistency approximating that of clay. This latter characteristic was taken advantage of by maintaining an air pressure in the heading equal to the hydrostatic head outside. When the material to be excavated formed a barrier against the entrance of water, thus permitting the heading to be advanced. The work began with sinking a shaft 38 feet in outside diameter, lined with 4 feet of brickwork to a depth of 54 feet below mean high water. On opposite sides of the shaft, in the direction of the length of the tunnel, false pieces of elliptical form 26 feet high and 24 feet wide were built. These were to be removed to permit the passage of the tunnel. An airlock, 6 feet in diameter by 15 feet long, was attached to the shaft cylinder above the false piece on the east side. A temporary working entrance to the tunnel was formed of 11 rings, each 2 feet wide, but of different diameters. The tops of these rings were in the same horizontal line, forming a cone-shaped chamber with steps of 18 inches leading to the airlock. From the base of this cone, which was 20 feet in diameter, 2 parallel single-track tunnels were started. As the largest ring was not large enough to take in both tunnels, a ring of a diameter equal to the exterior of the north tunnel was built and lined with 2 feet of brickwork. Regular tunnel work was then commenced. Silt was excavated till the top center plate of a new ring could be placed and bolted to the one behind. Then plates were bolted to either side of this top plate until the ring was completed. When 4 rings of plate equal to 10 feet of section had been placed and the heading cleared out, the masonry was laid. The plates were of 1/4-inch iron, 2 1/2 feet in width by 3 1/2 feet in length, flanged on all 4 sides with angle iron. The tunnels were 18 feet high by 16 feet wide, inside dimensions. The air pressure was kept about equal to the hydrostatic head, amounting to 18 pounds at the shaft and increasing to 36 pounds at a distance of 1,600 feet. No fixed rule could be given to govern the air pressure, but it was found generally that a little less than the hydrostatic pressure at the axis of the tunnel gave the best results under ordinary conditions. The excavated chamber was 23 feet in diameter, so that the difference of water pressure between the top and bottom of the chamber was about 11 pounds per square inch. Under these conditions, some air escaped through the roof and some water entered through the bottom. Excessive pressure resulted in an increased discharge of air through the roof, causing the silt to dry out and drop into the tunnel. If this mass was sufficient, a blowout and consequent flooding resulted. When the north tunnel had been advanced over a quarter of a mile, the south tunnel was started, and when this had been carried forward some distance, both tunnels were bulkheaded and work on the removal of the temporary entrance was commenced. A serious blowout occurred in July 1880. The doors of the airlocks had become wedged by falling earth and plates, cutting off the escape of the men, 20 of whom were drowned. This accident had an unfavorable effect upon the financial aspect of the undertaking. The New York end was started by sinking a timber caisson 48 by 29½ feet to a depth of 56 feet below high water, where it was fully embedded in sand. Through the west side of this caisson, on the line of the tunnel, an opening was cut and roof plates of the tunnel put in and braced. Plates were added till a section 12 feet long had been built, when an iron bulkhead was constructed. In building additional sections, the same system was adopted. As each section of the iron tube was completed, it was cleaned out and the brick lining laid. This was the first and only instance of building a subaqueous tunnel in sand without the aid of a shield. S. Pearson & Son of England assumed the contract in 1888. Sir John Fowler and Sir Benjamin Baker acted as consulting engineers. The shield method of driving was adopted and heavy iron plates were substituted for masonry. The light boiler plate lining was no longer required. The work was stopped through lack of capital, and unsuccessful attempts were made at various times to resume the operations until the early part of 1902. In that year, the franchise and property of the Tunnel Company were acquired by the New York and New Jersey Railroad Company, and operations were again started. In 1905, the New York and New Jersey Railroad Company disposed of their interests in the Hudson Company, who have since completed the tunnels. The completion of this work, which is now known as the McAdoo system, is described in another chapter. End of The Subways and Tunnels of New York, Methods and Cost, by Gilbert H. Gilbert. Read by Chad Sawyer.
The Peruvian Earthquake of 1868, a selection from an article in Harper's Monthly, April 1869, titled The Great South American Earthquakes of 1868, by Ephraim George Squire. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The 12 months embraced between the 1st of October 1867 and the 1st of October 1868 were distinguished by a series of physical phenomena more remarkable than is known to have occurred during any equal period of time in history. The series was grandly initiated and typified by the startling atmospheric and terrestrial convulsions that afflicted the Windward Islands in the autumn of the first named year, and which were fast followed by fearful hurricanes, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions in almost every quarter and country of the globe, culminating with the great South American earthquakes of the 13th and 16th of August, 1868. These earthquakes, for their extent, violence, and widespread devastation, will probably be regarded as the most terrible on record. They were felt more or less severely over an extent from north to south of more than 60 degrees of latitude, all the way from the Isthmus to the Cape. yet their lateral action seems to have been checked on the east, certainly by the chain of the Cordillera, and effectually stopped by the Andes. What tremendous force they exerted beneath the vast waste of waters extending from Peru to Cathay, we can only infer from those tidal waves which broke equally on the shores of the Pacific Islands and on those of distant New Zealand, Japan, and California. The Peruvian earthquake was felt from the equator to latitude 43 degrees in Chile, over a coastline of upward of 3,000 miles. It was also felt inland, although but lightly beyond the Cordillera of the coast, past the great despoblado, or uninhabited region at Puno, on the shores of Lake Titicaca, in Cusco, the old Inca capital, and at La Paz, the capital of Bolivia. In fact, over an area of not far from 450,000 square miles. Its effects, or those of concurrent phenomena in the Pacific, seem to have been limited only by the shores of that vast ocean, since nearly synchronous tidal disturbances were felt on the shores of Australia, of China and Japan, at the Sandwich Islands, and on the coasts of California and Alaska. Its devastating force, however, was chiefly expended in Peru, and here its most conspicuous incidents were to the south of Lima, and consisted in the destruction of the city of Arequipa and the port of Arica. Moquegua and a few other interior towns, including the great mining town of Cerro de Pasco, suffered heavily and directly by the earthquake, but Arica, Iquique, Chala, and the other seaports were exposed to double disaster, for all along the coast the implacable sea completed the destruction the earthquake had begun. The greatest loss of life and property at any one place in Peru was at Arequipa, the second city in size, population, wealth, social and political importance in the Republic. In short, the rival of Lima, and often politically its master. It stands in latitude 12 degrees 2 minutes south and longitude 77 degrees 8 minutes west, at the foot of the great symmetrical volcanic cone of Misti, 20,300 feet high, on a beautiful plain, one of the interior oases that occur at the foot of the Cordillera, which I have already described. This plain, elevated 7,850 feet above the sea, is watered by the river Chili, and between it and the sea at Isle, which is the port of Arequipa, intervenes an unbroken desert, relieved only by medanos, or crescent-shaped, shifting sand hills, and the skeletons of men, mules, and horses that have perished in the transit. Before the conquest, the Incas had made an establishment here for facilitating communication between their capital and the coast, and called it Arequipai, yes, rest here, from which, with slight variation, comes the name of the modern city, founded by the great Pizarro himself in 1540. A late census showed it to contain about 50,000 inhabitants, and as through it most of the trade with those vast interior departments of Peru, Cusco, and Puno was carried on, it had become, together with its local resources, rich and luxurious. Probably no town in South America was so well built. Its houses, if not altogether imposing, were massive and strong, constructed of a light but tough volcanic stone, vaulted and seldom of more than one story. This style of architecture was adopted in 1821, after the great earthquake of that year, which had laid most of the city in ruins, as a security against a similar catastrophe, and the new buildings successfully resisted all subsequent convulsions, many of them formidable, until the 13th of August, when they were thrown down, despite their strength, like the card houses that children build. Its cathedral, a modern building of a rather extraordinary architectural style, was nevertheless a vast and imposing edifice, and believed by most of the self-complacent Arequipans to be among the finest structures in the world. It had a bell cast in Arequipa itself, and one of its lions of greater size than that of St. Paul's in London. Apart from these more obvious distinctions, the indices of wealth, activity, and enterprise, Arequipa contended that it was the most intelligent and vivacious, and in science and art the most advanced city in Peru. It even ventured on the bold assumption that its women were more beautiful than those of Lima. As impartial writers, we must admit that this self-sufficiency was not wholly unfounded. Most of the distinguished names in modern Peruvian history, whether in government, art, literature, commerce, or war, belong to Arequipa, albeit it is constantly involved in intrigue and revolution, which led to its bombardment by President Prado for 3 days in December 1867, with a destruction supplemented by that of the earthquake that took place 9 months later. The bombardment, however, was unsuccessful, and its failure cost Prado his place at the head of the government. Notwithstanding its position so much further inland, Arequipa seems to have been, from its foundation, nearly as frequently exposed to earthquakes as Lima itself. Among the most celebrated are those of January 2nd, 1582, February 18th, 1600, November 23rd, 1604, December 9th, 1609, 1613, May 20th, 1666, April 23rd, 1668, October 21st, 1687, August 22nd, 1715, May 13th, 1784, 1812, July 10th, 1821, June 3rd, 1825, and October 9th, 1831. Of these, that of 1582, from all accounts, seems to have been the severest, and it is said was so fearful in the interior that the Guanacos and Vicuñas of the mountains fled to the city and sought refuge in the habitations of men, tame with fright. The story of the final destruction of this somewhat haughty city is perhaps best told in the following concise letter from that place, dated August 16, 3 days after the event. This city was completely destroyed by an earthquake on the 13th instant. Not a church left standing, not a house habitable. The shock commenced at 20 minutes past 5 p.m. and lasted from 6 to 7 minutes. The houses, being solidly built and of one story, resisted for about 1 minute, which gave time for the people to rush into the middle of the streets. So the mortality, though considerable, is not so great as might have been expected. If the earthquake had taken place at night, few indeed would have been left to tell the story. As it is, the prisoners in the carcel, public prison, and the sick in the hospital have perished. The earthquake commenced with an undulating movement, and as the shock culminated, no one could keep his feet. The houses rocked as a ship in the trough of the sea, and came crumbling down. The shrieks of the women, the crash of falling masonry, the upheaving of the earth, and the clouds of blinding dust made up a scene that cannot be described. We had 19 minor shocks the same night. Nothing has as yet been done towards disinterring the dead. I do not think any are buried alive, as certain death must have been the fate of all those who were not able to get into the street. The earth has opened in all the plains around, and water has appeared in various places. Another account from an eyewitness, dated August 16, describes the event as follows. At about 4 minutes past 5 p.m. last Thursday, the 13th, a slight movement of the earth was noticeable here by persons who chanced to be seated. There was no rumbling. In about 8 to 10 seconds more, the movement became strong enough for persons not seated to notice. This movement gradually increased in strength until, after about 30 seconds, pieces of timber began to fall from the houses. In about a minute all were satisfied that a great earthquake was at hand. Then began a terrible rumbling, similar to the noise of an avalanche. Everyone ran to the open spaces. It seemed as if the earth was about to open. The earth shook, and every structure swayed to and fro from north to south. It seemed in my own house as if the walls were about to meet and smother us. In about 3 minutes the soil shook so that it was almost impossible to hold one's feet. The strongest buildings began then to cast off stones, bricks, pieces of wood, etc., and the weakest began to fall, almost all of them level with the ground. In about 5 minutes from the first movement, the whole city was enveloped in clouds of dust and darkness, and resounded with the crash of falling buildings. There is not one house left standing in Arequipa. The only church tower left is that of Santa Catalina, but it, like the cathedral, will have to be pulled down. Santo Domingo Church is down to the ground. The Portal de Flores is all down, as well as all the surrounding blocks. Nearly all the inmates of the prison and hospitals perished. Many persons are known to have been crushed to death in the streets. We are now living in a tent on the river bank. No one dares go to town, as the shocks still continue to bring down what little is left standing. They occur at intervals of half an hour each. This evening some of the shocks have been very violent. So far there have been about 76 shocks up to 8 p.m. The river Pancarpata has changed to 3 colors, which makes us believe that the volcanoes are at work. Everything is confusion, and the cries and lamentations that we hear are heart-rending. Thus the work of the Arequipeños for 300 years has been destroyed in a few minutes. It will take an age to do the same work over. The debris of the Jesuits' church was hurled to a distance of 100 yards. The picture presented by our desolate city is sad indeed. God grant that our fears be not realized, for Mount Misty is vomiting lava, clouds of smoke, and quantities of mud, and darkness hides its sides from our view. We hear the constant noise of falling rocks and earth, and the river is impassable, owing to its black color and sulphurous odor. As already said, Arequipa stood at the foot of the great volcano Misti, which had not been in eruption during the historical period, but which now burst into activity, in which it still remains. At the time of the eruption, those who were outside the city saw huge pieces of rock split off from it, and together with heavy avalanches of snow and ice tumble down to the bottom, making a fearful noise. The river that is fed by the snows of the mountain increased at least 1/3 inside of 6 hours. Indeed, the rise in the water was so great and rapid as to inundate several of the towns in the valley of Arequipa, sweeping away the ruins the earthquake had made, together with the dead and the wounded. As to the loss of life and property, the prefect of Arequipa, writing under the deepest impression of horror and in profound affliction, reported officially, "All the edifices have been thrown to the ground, and the few walls that remain are so racked that they will require to be demolished." Another report states the number of buildings absolutely ruined at between 4,000 and 5,000, besides 22 churches, including the cathedral. The prisoners in the jails and the patients in the hospitals, unable to avail themselves of the warning which enabled the people generally to save their lives, were all crushed. Thanks to the premonitory shocks, the strength of the edifices, and their comparatively small height, which prevented them from covering the streets when their walls fell outward, the number of victims outside the hospitals and jails does not appear to have exceeded 300, with from 1,000 to 1,200 severely injured. Still, until the ruins are cleared, it will be impossible to ascertain the number of the dead. About 90 miles to the southeast of Arequipa, in another fertile oasis, situated 60 miles back from the sea, in the center of a considerable wine-producing district, is the large town of Moquegua, from which the southern department of Peru takes its name. Immediately behind it, forming part of the chain of the Cordillera, are three great volcanoes, that of Umate, called by the Indians Huaynaputina, Ubinas, and Tutupaca. The first named broke out in a fearful eruption in 1600. The latter seems to have done so simultaneously with the occurrence of the earthquake under notice, and throughout Peru is believed to have been its center of action. At any rate, the convulsion was as severe in Moquegua as in Arequipa, and from all reports attended with as heavy loss of life. The following account of the catastrophe here is from a letter of a resident dated August 30th. The movement of the shocks was from east to west, alternating with vertical vibrations. I noticed this especially, and the earth seemed as if about to open under my feet and leave me in the air. The shocks lasted from 5 to 6 minutes. When the buildings had tumbled, we were almost choked with dust, but a western breeze soon dispelled the clouds. The earth did not cease shaking until Sunday the 22nd of August. The shocks were more or less violent, but were always preceded by heavy discharges of electricity, louder than the heaviest cannonading. In about 5 minutes, every structure in the valley was in literally complete dilapidation, not a stone left on another. In the limestone lands all the hills were split, and the rocks were rent into small pieces. Along the river and in the lowlands of the vineyards, large openings were made, whence issued streams of blackish and pestiferous water. I assure you that I have seen as vivid a picture of Judgment Day as is possible in this world. The damage done to our crops will amount to about 25%. The inhabitants of this city and valley are encamped in the parks and fields. Some are in groups with their friends, others in tents or huts, and some in the open air. 90 miles from Moquegua, still to the southwest, is the city of Tacna, capital of the department, and one of the most important and active towns in Peru. I have described this town, which I visited in 1864, in this magazine for April 1868, and hence only need to say here, in explanation of the fact of its suffering very little in the great earthquake, that it is a modern town, built chiefly of wooden houses of one story, which may be racked, but which could hardly be thrown down by any convulsion of the earth. Nevertheless, 40 buildings were destroyed, probably some of the few built of stone or adobes, and a few lives were lost. While, however, Tacna escaped thus lightly, Arica, its port, 40 miles to the southwest, was absolutely destroyed by the earthquake and its attendant phenomena. Our accounts of the catastrophe at this point are much more full and accurate than from any other, and probably the event will be best remembered from its devastations here. Although next to Callao, the most important port of Peru, it was not that rich and populous place that many accounts of the earthquake have represented. Instead of having, as some of these state, a population of from 30 to 40,000 souls, it probably had less than 6,000, and although rather picturesque and showy from the water, was meanly built. The mole, custom house, the warehouses, and some of the residences and offices of foreigners were large and substantial modern structures, but the remaining buildings were either of adobes or canes plastered over, yet well adapted to resist earthquakes. The great shock of the earthquake of August 13 took place here a few minutes earlier than it did in Arequipa, showing that Arica was nearer the center of action than the latter town. As there, it was also preceded by premonitory shocks, which had the effect of alarming the inhabitants and driving them into the streets or open squares, and to the sand hills back of the town, where they were in comparative safety. An eyewitness says, "The hour was that when, by custom, most of the inhabitants had just closed their daily labors and were at their homes. The instant the startling indications of an earthquake were felt, there was a general rush for uncovered spaces, which were reached by many uninjured, but not by all. The streets became a scene of terror. All the houses in the city trembled as if affected with the ague. Then they surged, and some of them fell to pieces with crash after crash. At this juncture, when the undulations were most active, the earth opened in several places in long and almost regular lines. The fissures were from 1 to 3 inches in width. The sensation was as though something was rolling underneath. From every fissure there rushed forth dry earth like dust, which was followed by a stifling gas. Owing to the demolition of buildings and the general destruction of all kinds of property, and the dust that was raised, as well as that set in motion by the general tumult, a dense cloud formed over the city and obscured the light. Beneath the cloud the gas severely oppressed every living creature, and would have suffocated all if it had lingered longer than it did, which was only about 90 seconds. The undulations were 3 in number. Each succeeding one was of greater magnitude than the previous one. When the undulations ceased, the cloud of dust ascended and dispersed, and light was restored. Then shocks at short intervals succeeded, as though subterranean explosions or collisions were taking place. At this time people from all parts of the city fled to the hills amidst falling bricks and timbers, which fell from swaying walls and broadly rent buildings, just on the eve of crumbling into perfect ruin. Some were struck dead by the falling materials, and others were maimed, while all were made to stagger from side to side like people in a state of intoxication. Many of both sexes carried children in their arms, and those who had not these conveyed articles of value. The avarice of many was stronger than fear even amidst this terrible confusion, and hence there were those who dallied to collect valuables, many of whom suffered for their temerity, either by the sacrifice of their lives or otherwise. As the rush for the hills continued, and stones and materials of all kinds were falling, and houses and parts of them were crashing, numerous people were struck down, and either killed or dangerously hurt. Another eyewitness, a Peruvian, writing the following day, relates, "The main shock lasted from 7 to 10 minutes. Beasts and birds were wild with affright, and as buildings rocked and fell with deafening crashes, the earth rose and sank like the waves of the troubled sea. The people who could not keep their feet uttered frightful shrieks at the continued commotion, which went on increasing and seemed to announce the end of the world. The very mountains seemed to rise and totter and fall. The whole surface of the level land moved and broke like a disturbed pool of water, and it was impossible to stand except as one ran with headlong violence. I have never witnessed anything so appalling and terrible, and I have to stop writing now in consequence of the renewed shaking." At this time there lay in the harbor of Arica the United States double-ender 12-gun warship Watery, the United States storeship Fredonia, towed down in July to escape the yellow fever prevailing in Callao, the Peruvian ironclad America of 14 guns, the English brig Chanarcillo, the Chilean schooners Rosa Rivera and Regalon, the British ship Kamehameha. These data are important, for almost simultaneously with the earthquake on land occurred such disturbances of the sea as never before had a parallel on the coast after the Callao catastrophe of 1746. An officer of the Wateree describes the scene on shore and what happened on the sea in these graphic words. On the afternoon of August 13, as we were finishing our dinner on board the Wateree at about 20 minutes past 5 o'clock, immense clouds of dust were seen at a distance of some 10 miles south of Arica. This, of course, attracted attention as a matter of unusual occurrence. The volume of clouded dust came nearer and nearer, and it was observed from the deck of the vessel that the peaks of mountains in the chain of the Cordilleras began to wave to and fro like reeds in a storm. There could have been no optical delusion about it, for the sea was calm and the vessel was perfectly quiet. A few minutes after, it was observed that from mountains nearer to Arica, whole piles of rock rent themselves loose, and large mounds of earth and stone rolled down the sides. Very soon it was noticed that the whole earth was shaking, and that an earthquake was in progress. By comparing distances of ports reached by the earthquake successively, and computing the time by exact measurement, it was ascertained that the volcanic element under the surface of the globe at that particular spot traveled at the rate of between 600 and 700 miles an hour. When the convulsion reached the Morro, a rocky precipice lining one side of the harbor, it also began to move. Pieces of from 10 to 25 tons in weight began to move from their base and fall, altering the whole front view of that part of the coast. At the same moment the town commenced to crumble into ruins. The noise, the rumbling like the echoes of thunder, the explosive sounds like that of firing a heavy battery were terrific and deafening, and the whole soil of the country, as far as it could be seen, was moving, first like a wave and in the direction from south to north. Then it trembled, and at last it shook heavily, throwing into a heap of ruins 2/3 of all the houses of Arica. Men, women, and children ran into any open space near at hand, and their shrieks and screams could be heard distinctly on board the shipping. Even the custom house, built of iron, stone, and adobe, received a wide crack at the first shock. Shock after shock followed. On several places openings were becoming visible in the ground, and sulphurous vapor issued from them. At this juncture a crowd of people flocked to the mole, seeking boats to take refuge on the vessels in the harbor. As yet the shipping in the harbor felt not the least commotion from the disturbances on land. After the first shock there was a rest. No breeze could be felt. No ripple was seen on the waters. The Wateree and the Fredonia sent their surgeons ashore to assist the wounded. Between 50 and 60 of the people of the town had reached the mole by this time to take to the boats, but the surgeons had hardly landed, and but few of the others had entered the boats, when the sea quietly receded from the shore, leaving the boats high and dry on the beach. The water had not receded further than the distance of extremely low tide, when, all at once, on the whole levee of the harbor, it commenced to rise. It appeared at first as if the ground of the shore was sinking, but the mole being carried away, the people on the mole were seen floating. The little pagoda used as an office for the captain of the port was also floating, and the water still rose until it reached a height of 34 feet above the high water mark, and overflowed the town, and rushed through the streets, and threw down, by the force of its weight, what the earthquake had left. And all this rise and overflow of the waters took only about 5 minutes. The water rushed back into the ocean more suddenly than it had advanced upon the land, and carried with it the custom house and the residence of the English consul. This awful spectacle of destruction by the receding flood had hardly been realized when the sea rose again, and now the vessels in port began dragging. The water rose to the same height as before, and on rushing back it brought not only the debris of the ruined city with it, but even a locomotive and tender and a train of 4 cars were seen carried away by the fearful force of the waves. During this advance of the sea inland, another terrific shock, lasting about 8 minutes, was felt, the thunders of the earth and the storm of the waves surpassing all conception of human endurance. At this time, all around the city, the dust formed into clouds, and obscuring the sky, made things on land quite invisible. It was then that the thundering approach of a heavy sea wave was noticed, and a minute afterwards a sea wall of perpendicular height, to the extent of from 42 to 45 feet, capped with a fringe of bright glistening foam, swept over the land, stranding far inshore the United States steamer Wateree, the America, a Peruvian frigate, and the Chañarcillo, an English merchant vessel. The commander of the Peruvian ironclad America, after describing the fate of that vessel, says, "The American man-of-war Wateree is about a mile further up the beach than we are. Of the Fredonia, not a plank is left. The English vessel Chañarcillo and the Chilean ones Rosa Rivera and Regalon are lost. Not a single boat is left in this bay, and scarcely a single person of those that were aboard the lost vessels is known to have been saved. In these our moments of supreme distress, we find our salvation in the officers and crew of the United States man-of-war Wateree. Their whole cargo is safe and sound, and they have therefore clothed and fed us, and offered every comfort that we need. It is my pleasant duty to make this fact known to your Excellency, as well as the noble conduct of Doctors Winslow and Du Bois, the former of the Wateree and the latter of the Fredonia. Both have with the utmost zeal attended to our wounds. In the midst of such distress, I had the satisfaction of witnessing the rare gallantry of my men. The sailors were unwilling to leave the ship, although ordered to do so, until they were allowed to carry us off on their shoulders, as we could scarcely walk from wounds." The Wateree, to which complimentary reference is here made, was a compact and trustworthy vessel. Her commander, impelled by motives of humanity, went on shore immediately after the shock that had prostrated the town, in the hope of rescuing some of the officers of the Fredonia and their wives who were there. The officer left in charge of the vessel seems to have been equal to the emergency that followed. The guns were lashed, lifelines were rigged, and her most powerful anchors thrown out. 11 tidal waves struck her, and she was several times swept up and down the coast by irregular currents before she was thrown on shore, with the loss of but a single man, and standing as erect in her sandy bed as she did in the docks where she was built. The single person connected with the Wateree who was lost was a man named Tate, boatswain of the captain's gig. With the submergence of the Mole, where he was waiting the orders of his superior officer, he was carried out to sea by the recession of the wave, and as rapidly driven back on the shore. Recognizing at once his doom, and the futility of any effort to avert it, he seized his country's ensign, and with it waved a last adieu to his comrades on the Wateree, surging unmanageably under the terrible sea bore. Captain J. H. Gillis of the Wateree addressed to Admiral Turner, then commander of the United States squadron in the South Pacific, a report in which he says, "The Wateree lies about 3 miles to the northwest of the city, and about 450 yards inland. Although her hull has suffered much, still she appears to be in perfect condition. Not a plank has been started, and she stands upright as though in a dry dock. Considering her position and its slight elevation above the sea, we do not think it possible to float her again. It would be impossible to dig under her, as the means are not at hand, and it would cost more than what the vessel is worth. My crew remain aboard by day, but as the rumbling of earthquakes still continues, and the Peruvian sloop of war America is ashore below us in a direct line, with broadside on us, I have deemed it advisable to remove them. Another sea-bore would smash both vessels. I lent what aid in the way of provisions that I could to the inhabitants of Arica, but have been forced to suspend it, as I have scarcely what will suffice for my men. I shall remain by my vessel until further instructions from you. We have lost all our anchors, and if we have another rush of the sea that will turn the ship on beam ends, she will become a worthless hulk. The Fredonia, United States storeship of 800 tons and 6 guns, with a crew of 30 persons, seems to have become unmanageable from the first, and was dashed to pieces on the black and sinister reefs that lie in front of the rocky headland called El Morro de Arica. All on board were lost. The captain and 4 others who were on shore were saved, as was the surgeon of the Wateree, whose wife, however, was killed in his arms by falling timbers as he was carrying her to a place of safety. The number killed in Arica was estimated at about 400, mostly by the great wave that swept over the town. The larger part of these were plunderers who thronged to the ruins after the first shock was past, or avaricious persons returning to look after their valuables. And it is worthy of note that in every place in Peru and Ecuador, the earthquake, instead of overawing criminals, pilferers, and thieves, seems to have given them new audacity and activity. The crash and ruin excited open and developed latent crime, and rapine and murder held high carnival among the wrecks of cities and over the mangled bodies of the dead. The Viceroy of Peru had good reason to rear his gibbets in Lima and Callao in 1746, yet it is a strange reflection that the symbol of man's vengeance should have a restraining effect on human conduct beyond the most impressive manifestations of divine power. The loss of property in Arica is described as amounting to several millions of dollars. As it was not only the seaport of Tacna, but in fact of a large part of Bolivia, the amount of foreign merchandise stored there, including quantities of alpaca wool, oars, and cinchona bark coming down from the interior, was very large. All this was lost. The proprietor of the largest warehouse, connected with which was a distillery, returning to the place after the catastrophe, was unable to point out the site of his establishment, the destruction was so complete. The desert hills around Arica are stuffed with desiccated bodies of the ancient Aymaras, who seem to have had here an important fishing station. To these hills the terrified inhabitants of the town fled on the first warnings of danger, there to be met with the appalling spectacle of the grave literally giving up its dead. The convulsed and writhing earth threw to the surface hundreds of the grim, dried bodies of the Indians who had lived here centuries before, still wrapped in the coarse cerements that the dry and nitrous soil had preserved from decay. End of The Peruvian Earthquake of 1868, a selection from an article in Harper's Monthly, April 1869, titled The Great South American Earthquakes of 1868, by Ephraim George Squire. Read for LibriVox by Sue Anderson.
The Pleasures of Friendship by Samuel Johnson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life has no pleasure higher or nobler than that of friendship. It is painful to consider that this sublime enjoyment may be impaired or destroyed by innumerable causes, and that there is no human possession of which the duration is less certain. Many have talked in very exalted language of the perpetuity of friendship, of invincible constancy, and unalienable kindness, and some examples have been seen of men who have continued faithful to their earliest choice, and whose affection has predominated over changes of fortune and contrariety of opinion. But these instances are memorable because they are rare. The friendship which is practiced or expected by common mortals must take its rise from mutual pleasure, and must end when the power ceases of delighting each other. Many accidents therefore may happen by which the ardor of kindness will be abated, without criminal baseness or contemptible inconstancy on either part. To give pleasure is not always in our power, and little does he know himself who believes that he can be always able to receive it. Those who would gladly pass their days together may be separated by the different course of their affairs, and friendship, like love, is destroyed by long absence, though it may be increased by short intermissions. What we have missed long enough to want it, we value more when it is regained. But that which has been lost till it is forgotten will be found at last with little gladness, and with still less if a substitute has supplied the place. A man deprived of the companion to whom he used to open his bosom, and with whom he shared the hours of leisure and merriment, feels the day at first hanging heavy upon him. His difficulties oppress, and his doubts distract him. He sees time come and go without his wonted gratification, and all is sadness within, and solitude about him. But this uneasiness never lasts long. Necessity produces expedients, new amusements are discovered, and new conversation is admitted. No expectation is more frequently disappointed than that which naturally arises in the mind from the prospect of meeting an old friend after long separation. We expect the attraction to be revived and the coalition to be renewed. No man considers how much alteration time has made in himself, and very few inquire what effect it has had upon others. The first hour convinces them that the pleasure which they had formerly enjoyed is forever at an end. The opinions of both are changed, and the similitude of manners and sentiment is lost which confirmed them both in the approbation of themselves. Friendship is often destroyed by opposition of interest, not only by the ponderous and visible interest which the desire of wealth and greatness forms and maintains, but by 1,000 secret and slight competitions, scarcely known to the mind upon which they operate. There is scarcely any man without some favorite trifle which he values above greater attainments, some desire of petty praise which he cannot patiently suffer to be frustrated. This minute ambition is sometimes crossed before it is known, and sometimes defeated by wanton petulance. But such attacks are seldom made without the loss of friendship, for whoever has found the vulnerable part will be always feared, and the resentment will burn on in secret, of which shame hinders the discovery. This, however, is a slow malignity, which a wise man will obviate as inconsistent with quiet, and a good man will repress as contrary to virtue. But human happiness is sometimes violated by some more sudden strokes. A dispute begun in jest upon a subject which a moment before was on both parts regarded with careless indifference, is continued by the desire of conquest till vanity kindles into rage, and opposition rankles into enmity. Against this hasty mischief I know not what security can be obtained. Men will sometimes be surprised into quarrels, and though they might both hasten to reconciliation as soon as their tumult has subsided, yet two minds will seldom be found together which can at once subdue their discontent, or immediately enjoy the sweets of peace without remembering the wounds of the conflict. Friendship has other enemies. Suspicion is always hardening the cautious, and disgust repelling the delicate. Very slender differences will sometimes part those whom long reciprocation of civility or beneficence has united. Lone Love and Ranger retired into the country to enjoy the company of each other, and returned in 6 weeks cold and petulant. Ranger's pleasure was to walk in the fields, and Lone Love's to sit in a bower. Each had complied with the other in his turn, and each was angry that compliance had been exacted. The most fatal disease of friendship is gradual decay, or dislike hourly increased by causes too slender for complaint and too numerous for removal. Those who are angry may be reconciled. Those who have been injured may receive a recompense. But when the decay of pleasing and willingness to be pleased is silently diminished, the renovation of friendship is hopeless. As when the vital powers sink into languor, there is no longer any use of the physician. End of The Pleasures of Friendship by Samuel Johnson. Read by Colleen McMahon.
Poets by Frederick Meetsey. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Since I have known the body better, said Zarathustra to one of his disciples, the spirit hath only been to me symbolically spirit, and all the imperishable. That is also but a simile. So have I heard thee say once before, answered the disciple. And then thou addest, but the poets lie too much. Why didst thou say that the poets lie too much? Why? Said Zarathustra. Thou askest why. I do not belong to those who may be asked after their why. Is my experience but of yesterday? It is long ago that I experienced the reasons for mine opinions. Should I not have to be a cask of memory, if I also wanted to have my reasons with me? It is already too much for me even to retain mine opinions, and many a bird flieth away. And sometimes also do I find a fugitive creature in my dovecot, which is alien to me, and trembleth when I lay my hand upon it. But what did Zarathustra once say unto thee? That the poets lie too much. But Zarathustra also is a poet. Believest thou that he there spake the truth? Why dost thou believe it? The disciple answered, I believe in Zarathustra. But Zarathustra shook his head and smiled. Belief doth not sanctify me, said he, least of all the belief in myself. But granting that some one did say in all seriousness that the poets lie too much, he was right. We do lie too much. We also know too little, and are bad learners, so we are obliged to lie. And which of us poets hath not adulterated his wine? Many a poisonous hotch-potch hath evolved in our cellars. Many a indescribable thing hath there been done. And because we know little, therefore are we pleased from the heart with the poor in spirit, especially when they are young women. And even of those things are we desirous, which old women tell one another in the evening. This do we call the eternally feminine in us. And as if there were a special secret access to knowledge, which choketh up for those who learn anything, so do we believe in the people and in their wisdom. This, however, do all poets believe, that whoever pricketh up his ears when lying in the grass or on lonely slopes, learneth something of the things that are betwixt heaven and earth. And if there come unto them tender emotions, then do the poets always think that nature herself is in love with them, and that she stealeth to their ear to whisper secrets into it, and amorous flatteries, and of this they do plumb and pride themselves before all mortals. Ah, there are so many things betwixt heaven and earth, of which only the poets have dreamed, and especially above the heavens, for all gods are poet symbolizations, poet sophistications. Verily, ever are we drawn aloft, that is, to the realm of the clouds. On these do we set our gaudy puppets, and then call them gods and supermen. Are not they light enough for those chairs, all these gods and supermen? Ah, how I am weary of all the inadequate that is insisted on as actual. Ah, how I am weary of the poets. When Zarathustra so spake, his disciple resented it, but was silent. And Zarathustra also was silent, and his eye directed itself inwardly, as if it gazed into the far distance. At last he sighed and drew breath. I am of today and heretofore, said he thereupon, but something is in me that is of the morrow, and the day following, and hereafter. I became weary of the poets, of the old and of the new. Superficial are they all unto me, and shallow seas. They do not think sufficiently into the depth, therefore their feeling did not reach to the bottom. Some sensation of voluptuousness and some sensation of tetum. These have as yet been their best contemplation. Ghost breathing and ghost whisking seemeth to me all the jingle-jangle of their harps. What have they known hitherto of the fervour of tones? They are also not pure enough for me. They all muddle their water, that it may seem deep. And vain would they thereby prove themselves reconcilers, but mediaries and mixers are they unto me, and half and impure. Ah, I cast indeed my net into the sea, and meant to catch good fish, but always I did draw up the head of some ancient god. Thus did the sea give a stone to the hungry one, and they themselves may well originate from the sea. Certainly one findeth pearls in them, thereby they are the more like hard mollusks, and instead of a soul I have often found in them salt slime, and they have learned from the sea also its vanity. Is not the sea the peacock of peacocks? Even before the ugliest of all buffaloes doth it spread out its tail. Never doth it tire of its lace fan of silver and silk. Disdainfully doth the buffalo glance thereat, nigh to the sand with its soul, nigher still to the thicket, nighest, however, to the swamp. What is beauty and sea and peacock splendour to it? This parable I speak unto the poets. Verily their spirit itself is the peacock of peacocks, and a sea of vanity. Spectators seeketh the spirit of the poet. Should they even be buffaloes? But of this spirit became I weary, and I see the time coming when it will become weary of itself. Yea, changed have I seen the poets, and their glance turned towards themselves. Penitents of the spirit have I seen appearing. They grew out of the poets. Thus spake Zarathustra. End of Poets by Frederick Nietzsche.
Prohibition by Robert G. Ingersoll, first published in the New York World, October 21st, 1888, and then in the collected Works of Robert G. Ingersoll, Volume 8, Interviews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in May 2020. Prohibition. It has been decided by many courts in various states that the traffic in liquor can be regulated, that it is a police question. It has been decided by the courts in Iowa that its manufacture and sale can be prohibited, and not only so, but that a distillery or a brewery may be declared a nuisance and may legally be abated, and these decisions have been upheld by the Supreme Court of the United States. Consequently, it has been settled by the highest tribunal that states have the power either to regulate or to prohibit the sale of intoxicating liquors, and not only so, but that states have the power to destroy breweries and distilleries without making any compensation to the owners. So it has always been considered within the power of the state to license the selling of intoxicating liquors. In other words, this question is one that the states can decide for themselves. It is not, and should not be, in my judgment, a federal question. It is something with which the United States has nothing to do. It belongs to the states, and where a majority of the people are in favor of prohibition and pass laws to that effect, there is nothing in the Constitution of the United States that interferes with such action. The remaining question, then, is not a question of power, but a question of policy, and at the threshold of this question is another. Can prohibitory laws be enforced? There are today in Kansas, a prohibition state, more saloons, that is to say, more places in which liquor is sold, than there are in Georgia, a state without prohibition legislation. There are more in Nebraska, according to the population, more in Iowa, according to the population, than in many of the states in which there is the old license system. You will find that the United States has granted more licenses to wholesale and retail dealers in these prohibition states, according to the population, than in many others in which prohibition has not been adopted. These facts tend to show that it is not enough for the legislature to say, "Be it enacted." Behind every law there must be an intelligent and powerful public opinion. A law to be enforced must be the expression of such powerful and intelligent opinion. Otherwise it becomes a dead letter. It is avoided. Judges continue the cases, juries refuse to convict, and witnesses are not particular about telling the truth. Such laws demoralize the community, or to put it another way, demoralized communities pass such laws. Question to Mr. Ingersoll: what do you think of the prohibitory movement on general principles? Answer: the trouble is that when a few zealous men, intending to reform the world, endeavor to enforce unpopular laws, they are compelled to resort to detectives, to a system of espionage. For the purpose of preventing the sale of liquors, somebody has to watch. Eyes and ears must become acquainted with keyholes. Every neighbor suspects every other. A man with a bottle or a demijohn is followed. Those who drink get behind doors, in cellars and garrets. Hypocrisy becomes substantially universal. Hundreds of people become suddenly afflicted with a variety of diseases, for the cure of which alcohol in some form is supposed to be indispensable. Malaria becomes general, and it is perfectly astonishing how long a few pieces of Peruvian bark will last, and how often the liquor can be renewed without absorbing the medicinal qualities of the bark. The state becomes a paradise for patent medicine, the medicine being poor whiskey with a scientific name. Physicians become popular in proportion as liquor of some kind figures in their prescriptions. Then in the towns, clubs are formed, the principal object being to establish a saloon, and in many instances the drugstore becomes a favorite resort, especially on Sundays. There is, however, another side to this question. It is this: nothing in the world is more important than personal liberty. Many people are in favor of blotting out the sun to prevent the growth of weeds. This is the mistake of all prohibitory fanaticism. Question: what is true temperance, Colonel Ingersoll? Answer: men have used stimulants for many thousand years, and as much is used today in various forms as in any other period of the world's history. They are used with more prudence now than ever before, for the reason that the average man is more intelligent now than ever before. Intelligence has much to do with temperance. The barbarian rushes to the extreme for the reason that but little, comparatively, depends upon his personal conduct or personal habits. Now the struggle of life is so sharp, competition is so severe, that few men can succeed who carry a useless burden. The businessmen of our country are compelled to lead temperate lives, otherwise their credit is gone. Men of wealth, men of intelligence, do not wish to employ intemperate physicians. They are not willing to trust their health or their lives with a physician who is under the influence of liquor. The same is true of businessmen in regard to their legal interests. They insist upon having sober attorneys. They want the counsel of a sober man. So in every department. On the railways, it is absolutely essential that the engineer, that the conductor, the train dispatcher, and every other employee in whose hands are the lives of men should be temperate. The consequence is that under the law of the survival of the fittest, the intemperate are slowly but surely going to the wall. They are slowly but surely being driven out of employments of trust and importance. As we rise in the scale of civilization, we continually demand better and better service. We are continually insisting upon better habits, upon a higher standard of integrity, of fidelity. These are the causes, in my judgment, that are working together in the direction of true temperance. Question: Mr. Ingersoll, do you believe the people can be made to do without a stimulant? Answer. The history of the world shows that all men who have advanced one step beyond utter barbarism have used some kind of stimulant. Man has sought for it in every direction. Every savage loves it. Everything has been tried. Opium has been used by many hundreds of millions. Hashish has filled countless brains with chaotic dreams, and everywhere that civilization has gone, the blood of the grape has been used. Nothing is easier now to obtain than liquor. In 1 bushel of corn there are at least 5 gallons. 4 can easily be extracted. All starch, all sugars can be changed almost instantly into alcohol. Every grain that grows has in it the intoxicating principle, and as a matter of fact, nearly all of the corn, wheat, sugar, and starch that man eats is changed into alcohol in his stomach. Whether man can be compelled to do without a stimulant is a question that I am unable to answer. Of one thing I am certain, he has never yet been compelled to do without one. The tendency, I think, of modern times is toward a milder stimulant than distilled liquors. Whiskey and brandies are too strong. Wine and beer occupy the middle ground. Wine is a fireside, whiskey a conflagration. It seems to me that it would be far better if the prohibitionists would turn their attention toward distilled spirits. If they were willing to compromise, the probability is that they would have public opinion on their side. If you would say, you may have all the beer and all the wine and cider you wish, and you can drink them when and where you desire, but the sale of distilled spirits shall be prohibited. It is possible that this could be carried out in good faith in many, if not in most, of the states, possibly in all. We all know the effect of wine, even when taken in excess, is nothing near as disastrous as the effect of distilled spirits. Why not take the middle ground? The wine drinkers of the old country are not drunkards. They have been drinking wine for generations. It is drunk by men, women, and children. It adds to the sociability of the family. It does not separate the husband from the rest. It keeps them all together, and in that view is rather a benefit than an injury. Good wine can be raised as cheaply here as in any part of the world. In nearly every part of our country the grape grows, and good wine can be made. If our people had a taste for wine, they would lose the taste for stronger drink, and they would be disgusted with the surroundings of the stronger drink. The same may be said in favor of beer. As long as the prohibitionists make no distinction between wine and whiskey, between beer and brandy, just so long they will be regarded by most people as fanatics. The prohibitionists cannot expect to make this question a federal one. The United States has no jurisdiction of this subject. Congress can pass no laws affecting this question that could have any force except in such parts of the country as are not within the jurisdiction of states. It is a question for the states and not for the federal government. The prohibitionists are simply throwing away their votes. Let us suppose that we had a prohibition Congress and a prohibition president. What steps could be taken to do away with the drinking in the city of New York? What steps could be taken in any state of this union? What could by any possibility be done? A few years ago, the prohibitionists demanded above all things that the tax be taken from distilled spirits, claiming at that time that such a tax made the government a partner in vice. Now, when the Republican Party proposes, under certain circumstances, to remove that tax, the prohibitionists denounce the movement as one in favor of intemperance. We have also been told that the tax on whiskey should be kept for the reason that it increases the price, and that an increased price tends to make a temperate people, that if the tax is taken off, the price will fall, and the whole country start on the downward road to destruction. Is it possible that human nature stands on such slippery ground? Is it possible that our civilization today rests upon the price of alcohol, and that should the price be reduced, we would all go down together? For one, I cannot entertain such a humiliating and disgraceful view of human nature. I believe that man is destined to grow greater, grander, and nobler. I believe that no matter what the cost of alcohol may be, life will grow too valuable to be thrown away. Men hold life according to its value. Men, as a rule, only throw away their lives when they are not worth keeping. When life becomes worth living, it will be carefully preserved and will be hoarded to the last grain of sand that falls through the glass of time. Question. Mr. Ingersoll, what is the reason for so much intemperance? Answer. When many people are failures, when they are distanced in the race, when they fall behind, when they give up, when they lose ambition, when they finally become convinced that they are worthless, precisely as they are in danger of becoming dishonest. In other words, having failed in the race of life on the highway, they endeavor to reach the goal by going across slots, by crawling through the grass. Disguise this matter as we may, all people are not successes. All people have not the brain or the muscle or the moral stamina necessary to succeed. Some fall in one way, some in another, some in the net of strong drink, some in the web of circumstances, and others in 1,000 ways, and the world itself cannot grow better unless the unworthy fail. The law is the survival of the fittest, that is to say, the destruction of the unfit. There is no scheme of morals, no scheme of government, no scheme of charity that can reverse this law. If it could be reversed, then the result would be the survival of the unfittest, the speedy end of which would be the extinction of the human race. Temperance men say that it is wise, in so far as possible, to remove temptation from our fellow men. Let us look at this in regard to other matters. How do we do away with larceny? We cannot remove property. We cannot destroy the money of the world to keep people from stealing some of it. In other words, we cannot afford to make the world valueless to prevent larceny. All strength by which temptation is resisted must come from the inside. Virtue does not depend upon the obstacles to be overcome. Virtue depends upon what is inside of the man. A man is not honest because the safe of the bank is perfectly secure. Upon the honest man, the condition of the safe has no effect. We will never succeed in raising great and splendid people by keeping them out of temptation. Great people withstand temptation. Great people have what may be called moral muscle, moral force. They are poised within themselves. They understand their relations to the world. The best possible foundation for honesty is the intellectual perception that dishonesty can, under no circumstances, be a good investment, that larceny is not only wicked, but foolish, not only criminal, but stupid, that crimes are committed only by fools. On every hand there is what is called temptation. Every man has the opportunity of doing wrong. Every man in this country has the opportunity of drinking too much, has the opportunity of acquiring the opium habit, has the opportunity of taking morphine every day. In other words, has the opportunity of destroying himself. How are they to be prevented? Most of them are prevented, at least in a reasonable degree, and they are prevented by their intelligence, by their surroundings, by their education, by their objects and aims in life, by the people they love and the people who love them. No one will deny the evils of intemperance, and it is hardly to be wondered at that people who regard only one side, who think of the impoverished and wretched, of wives and children in want, of desolate homes, become the advocates of absolute prohibition. At the same time, there is the philosophic side, and the question is whether more good cannot be done by moral influence, by example, by education, by the gradual civilization of our fellow men, than in any other possible way. The greatest things are accomplished by indirection. In this way, the idea of force, of slavery, is avoided. The person influenced does not feel that he has been trampled upon, does not regard himself as a victim. He feels rather as a pupil, as one who receives a benefit, whose mind has been enlarged, whose life has been enriched, whereas the direct way of thou shalt not produces an antagonism. In other words, it produces the natural result of I will. By removing one temptation, you add strength to others. By depriving a man of one stimulant, as a rule, you drive him to another, and the other may be far worse than the one from which he has been driven. We have hundreds of laws making certain things misdemeanors, which are naturally right. Thousands of people, honest in most directions, delight in outwitting the government, derive absolute pleasure from getting in a few clothes and gloves and shawls without the payment of duty. Thousands of people buy things in Europe for which they pay more than they would for the same things in America, and then exercise their ingenuity in slipping them through the custom house. A law to have real force must spring from the nature of things, and the justice of this law must be generally perceived, otherwise it will be evaded. The temperance people themselves are playing into the hands of the very party that would refuse to count their votes. Allow the Democrats to remain in power, allow the Democrats to be controlled by the South, and a large majority might be in favor of temperance legislation, and yet the votes would remain uncounted. The party of reform has a great interest in honest elections, and honest elections must first be obtained as the foundation of reform. The prohibitionists can take their choice between these parties. Would it not be far better for the prohibitionists to say, "We will vote for temperance men. We will stand with the party that is the nearest in favor of what we deem to be right"? They should also take into consideration that other people are as honest as they, that others disbelieve in prohibition as honestly as they believe in it, and that other people cannot leave their principles to vote for prohibition, and they must remember that these other people are in the majority. Mr. Fisk knows that he cannot be elected president, knows that it is impossible for him to carry any state in the Union. He also knows that in nearly every state in the Union, probably in all, a majority of the people believe in stimulants. Why not work with the great and enlightened majority? Why rush to the extreme for the purpose not only of making yourself useless, but hurtful? No man in the world is more opposed to intemperance than I am. No man in the world feels more keenly the evils and the agony produced by the crime of drunkenness. And yet I would not be willing to sacrifice liberty, individuality, and the glory and greatness of individual freedom to do away with all the evils of intemperance. In other words, I believe that slavery, oppression, and suppression would crowd humanity into 1,000 deformities, the result of which would be 1,000 times more disastrous to the well-being of man. I do not believe in the slave virtues, in the monotony of tyranny, in the respectability produced by force. I admire the men who have grown in the atmosphere of liberty, who have the pose of independence, the virtues of strength, of heroism, and in whose hearts is the magnanimity, the tenderness, and the courage born of victory. End of Prohibition by Robert G. Ingersoll.
Saving Mr. Lincoln by Central Intelligence Agency. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Winston Tharp. On February 11, 1861, Abraham Lincoln said his farewell to the people of his hometown of Springfield, Illinois, and boarded a train that would take him to Washington for his inauguration on March 4th. As he started out, rumors of assassination plots circulated in several cities along the planned route. In Washington, stories spread that assassins would strike down Lincoln before or during his inauguration. The South Carolina legislature had responded to Lincoln's election by unanimously voting to secede from the Union, leading the march of the Southern states towards secession. "Civil war," said an Ohio newspaper, "is as certain to follow secession as darkness to follow the going down of the sun." The Union was tearing apart, and so, it seemed, was the nation's capital itself. Rumors of plots swirled around the city. Secessionist congressmen were said to be planning to kidnap lame duck President James Buchanan so that Vice President and future Confederate General John C. Breckinridge, who had run against Lincoln as a pro-slavery candidate, could seize power. Minutemen from Virginia and Maryland were reportedly ready to invade the city. Charles Pomeroy Stone, a West Point graduate who had served in the Mexican War, was in Washington when the secessions began. Concerned about the rumors, he called upon his old commander, now Lieutenant General Winfield Scott, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Army. Scott made Stone a colonel and named him Inspector General of the District of Columbia Militia. Most of the U.S. Army was in Indian country, far beyond the reach of railroads. Washington's potential defenders included volunteer units of dubious loyalty. These included the National Rifles, whose captain said his men stood ready to guard the frontier of Maryland and help to keep the Yankees from coming down to coerce the South. Like many other Army officers of the time, Stone had to grope for military intelligence, using whatever resources he managed to find. There was no formal military intelligence organization, and counterintelligence was an unknown art. Stone realized that he needed help from civilians with special skills, detectives. The U.S. government, lacking any federal investigative agency, often used private detectives to track down counterfeiters and mail thieves. Suspecting that the National Rifles harbored secessionists, Stone planted a detective in the ranks and told him to keep the unit's captain under surveillance. Stone's detective told him that the men of the National Rifles were planning to storm the Treasury building as part of a plot to take over Washington. Stone also learned that more than 300 other men, known as National Volunteers, were drilling in a hall above a large livery stable. Stone gave the task of penetrating that group to a skillful New York detective who had been loaned to the Army. Through the detective's undercover work, Stone was able to learn enough to force the disbanding of the National Volunteers. Their captain, Dr. Cornelius Boyle, a prominent Washington physician, left the capital and later became a Confederate intelligence officer. Stone's counterintelligence efforts also purged the National Rifles of secessionists. The unit became one of 30 companies formed by Washingtonians loyal to the Union and ready to defend both the Capitol and Lincoln. Soon after Lincoln's train left Springfield, Stone began receiving reports of assassination plots. So many clear indications pointed to Baltimore that 3 good detectives of the New York police force were constantly employed there, Stone recalled. In a classic example of intelligence analysis, he compared the detectives' reports to the information received from independent sources. Stone did not mention another detective, Allan Pinkerton, founder of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Samuel Morse Fenton, president of the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad, had hired Pinkerton after hearing reports that rabid secessionists in Baltimore were planning to cut Baltimore off from Washington by burning bridges and sinking the Susquehanna River train ferry. Pinkerton went to Baltimore with 5 operatives, including a trusted assistant, Kate Warren, described by Pinkerton as America's first woman detective. Pinkerton set up an office and posed as a stockbroker named John H. Hutchison. While investigating the sabotage rumors, Pinkerton heard of a plot to kill Lincoln in Baltimore when his train arrived from Harrisburg on February 23rd. Lincoln was to be taken by carriage to a private home for lunch and then returned to the train. While secessionists, the National Volunteers were mentioned, whipped up a riot, a barber who called himself Captain Ferrandini would kill Lincoln, vanish into the mob, and slip away to the south. Baltimore police would have only a small force at the scene, under orders from the mayor and chief of police, both Southern sympathizers. Pinkerton hoped to foil the plot by getting Lincoln to change his schedule. On February 21st, he met with Lincoln in a Chicago hotel room. Lincoln said he could not believe there was a conspiracy to kill him. Hours later, Frederick Seward, son of Senator William Henry Seward, arrived at Lincoln's room and warned him of the plot, which had been discovered independently by detectives working for Colonel Stone and General Scott. They had sent young Seward to Lincoln, who now was convinced. Next morning, Lincoln left by train for Harrisburg as scheduled, then boarded a special train, accompanied by his bodyguard, Ward H. Layman, a burly former law partner. When the train pulled into West Philadelphia, Pinkerton was waiting in a carriage. The telegraph to Baltimore was cut off. Agents were placed in telegraph offices in Harrisburg, Philadelphia, and New York City, where there was a special watch to hold up any messages about Lincoln's travels. The carriage took Lincoln and Layman to the yard of the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad. There Kate Warren met the carriage with 4 tickets for sleeping berths. She and Pinkerton, like Layman, were armed. The train pulled out shortly before 11 p.m. and arrived in Baltimore about 3:30 a.m. on February 23rd. Warren remained in Baltimore as the sleeping cars with Lincoln on board were shifted to another train, which arrived in Washington about 6 a.m. Later, Lincoln would say he regretted slipping into the Capitol like a thief in the night. On March 4th, the morning of the inauguration, Stone stationed riflemen in windows overlooking the broad steps where Lincoln would take the oath of office. Sharpshooters stood on roofs along the inaugural route to the Capitol as Lincoln rode past in an open carriage. Soldiers lined the streets. Under the platform where Lincoln stood, other soldiers huddled, guarding against bomb planters. Other troops formed a cordon at the foot of the steps. After Lincoln's inauguration, Stone continued to protect the Capitol, taking control of telegraph offices and the railroad station, and seizing boats on the Potomac to keep Confederate agents from using them. On April 12th, Confederate cannons in Charleston began firing on Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun. 9 days later, Pinkerton wrote to President Lincoln, offering to start obtaining information on the movements of the traitors or safely conveying your letters or dispatches. Before Lincoln responded, Major General George B. McClellan asked Pinkerton to set up a military intelligence service for McClellan's command, the Army's division of the Ohio. A former railroad executive, McClellan was Pinkerton's friend and former client. Pinkerton agreed, and with several operatives headed for McClellan's headquarters in Cincinnati. Like the detectives who had worked for Colonel Stone, Pinkerton would be a civilian, but he assumed a military cover name, Major E.J. Allen. The Eye That Never Sleeps. Allen Pinkerton, born in 1819 in Glasgow, Scotland, was the son of a police sergeant. At the age of 23, he emigrated to the United States. After working for a time as a cooper, he became first a deputy sheriff in Illinois and then a member of Chicago's newly organized police force. In 1850, he left the force as a detective and founded the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Pinkerton's code called for his agents to have no addiction to drink, smoking, card playing, low dives, or slang. On the front of his Chicago headquarters, he placed a sign with a huge eye bearing the company's slogan, "We Never Sleep." That Pinkerton logo was probably the origin of the term private eye. Pinkerton's detectives specialized in tracking and capturing gangs that robbed railroads. Through his work, Pinkerton met George B. McClellan, president of the Rock Island and Illinois Central Railroad, and its attorney, Abraham Lincoln. Those connections led to his work during the Civil War. After the war, Pinkerton returned to Chicago and basked in the publicity earned by Pinkerton detectives as they pursued such notorious bandits as the James Brothers and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Pinkertons, as they were called, also worked as strikebreakers for the executives of companies battling unions that were organizing rail workers and coal miners. Pinkerton died in 1884 and was buried in a family plot whose graves included that of Timothy Webster, one of his best agents who was hanged by the Confederates. Pinkerton had recovered Webster's remains after the war. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency continued as a family enterprise through 4 generations. Outsiders bought it and kept the Pinkerton name. In 1999, Securitas, an international security firm, acquired the Pinkerton Company. End of Saving Mr. Lincoln by Central Intelligence Agency.
The Story of the Alphabet by Otto F. Edge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Wayne Cook. Do you know your ABCs? Each letter character has a history and a reason for its present form. Have you ever questioned the origin and significance of the alphabet? Our transition from barbarism to civilization can be attributed to the alphabet. Those great prehistoric discoveries and inventions such as making of a fire, the use of tools, the wheel and the axle, and even our modern marvelous applications of steam and electricity pale into insignificance when compared with the power of the alphabet. Simple as it now appears after the accustomed use of ages, it can be accounted not only the most difficult, but the most fruitful of all the achievements of the human intellect. Man lived by bread alone, and without the alphabet untold ages, and with a practical alphabetic system not more than 3,000 years. So important and wonderful was this step deemed by those who lived nearer the time of its inception, in the time before the wonder of its extraordinary powers had been blunted by long possession and common use, that its invention, as well as that of writing, was invariably attributed to divine origin. Modern investigation always seeks sources other than mythological ones, and thus the science of ancient handwriting, paleography, came into existence. In the last 125 years, the writing of the ancient Egyptians, which was a sealed book for nearly 20 centuries, has been deciphered through the efforts of Champollion and Young. The mysterious cuneiform characters of ancient Assyria and Babylon have been interpreted by Grotefend and Rawlinson, and the missing link to connect our present alphabetic system to these ancient ones is being partly completed by Sir Arthur Evans, who is compiling and analyzing Cretan characters and pre-Phoenician writing. The story, however, will probably never be told in its entirety. The forms of our letters, with the exception of G, J, U, and W, reached their full development 2,000 years ago. The Roman letter was the parent of all the styles, notwithstanding the diversity that has appeared in Europe since the beginning of the Christian era. With a little imagination, it is not difficult to note the resemblance between similar letters of the old Roman capitals and those following, which have been designated as script, italic, Old English or black letter, versal, unical, and an endless list of alphabet families. The desire for speed and the influence of the tool, pen, reed, chisel, brush were the determining factors in the change of form. Curiously enough, instead of being archaic, the Roman alphabet, which is now 2,000 years old, is still the most useful because of its legibility, and also the most beautiful. We derive 23 of our letters from the Romans. They had taken probably 18 of these from the Greeks about the 4th century BC, and afterwards borrowed elsewhere or invented 7 more. Instead of giving them names as the Greeks did, they simply called them by the sounds for which they stood. A, B, pronounced bay. They introduced the curve whenever possible, whereas the early Greek letters were all angular. What an interesting analogy is evident in the architecture of these two peoples. The temple pediment and angularity of the Greeks as contrasted with the dome and arch of the Romans. The Greeks, in their contact with the great traders and Yankees of ancient time, the Phoenicians, saw the value of their alphabetic writing and inaugurated its use about the time of the first Olympiad, 776 BC. 3 or 4 centuries before they gave it to the Romans, the ancient Greeks found use for 15 of the Phoenician letters, and then conceived enough to round out an alphabet of 24 characters. The changes that took place in the shape of their letters can be attributed to their sense of order. The letters are balanced better, and the parts better related. The Greeks were interested in the sound value only, not in the picture value of the symbol, and, therefore, they probably did not notice that A, for instance, had ever been a picture of the head of an ox, and that it was now drawn upside down, and that the Phoenician name Alf meant ox, and that they mispronounced the sound in calling it alpha. The Romans borrowed from the Greeks, and the Greeks borrowed from the Phoenicians, but where did the Phoenicians obtain their letters? Did they invent them? To what extent were these letters influenced by earlier systems of writing, as those employed by the Cretan, Assyrian, and Egyptian civilizations? These are questions that probably will never be answered satisfactorily. Many arguments and theories are advanced. We can, however, trace back with certainty a number of our letters to the Phoenician alphabet of 1000 BC. Beyond this, all is, at present, a matter of conjecture. The Phoenician alphabet consisted of 22 pictures of familiar objects. These pictures were rudely and simply made, for writers and readers soon recognized the fundamental characteristics, and all unnecessary details were eliminated. The great advance that can be credited to them is that they realized that a small number of sound-expressing characters, if well selected, are sufficient to express any word. Other races at this period had phonetic systems, but they consisted of numerous symbols and cumbersome appendages of non-alphabetic characters, eye pictures, side by side with ear pictures. No doubt early Phoenician writing passed through the stages of development traceable in so many countries. 1. The pictures or characters suggesting the thing or incident, picture writing. 2. The pictures or characters symbolizing the thing or idea, ideographic or symbolic writing. 3. The pictures or characters representing the sound of the thing or idea, phonograms. And 4. The signs suggesting the various sounds of the language, alphabetic system. To free this last stage from the others was the great Phoenician contribution. A. Why is A the first letter? It represents one of the commonest vowel sounds in ancient languages. Naturally, the Phoenician alphabet makers selected a familiar object in the name of which this particular vowel sound was emphasized. Since food is of primal importance, it is not surprising to find that he chose the ox, Aleph, or rather the head of the ox, for the characteristics of animals are chiefly embodied in the head. Not only was the ox important as food, but also as a beast of burden, for the ox had been harnessed to the plow centuries before the horse was domesticated. Thus, one of the earliest and most important of man's friends among the brute creatures was honored. In making this letter repeatedly and rapidly, they became careless, and instead of crossing the letter V, they tried to make it with one continuous scratching. Hence, when the Greeks became acquainted with it, 3 to 5 centuries after its invention, the picture had deteriorated almost beyond recognition. They introduced balance, and the V was inverted, and the crossbar was retained between the lines. Unknowingly, they were drawing the ox head upside down, and it remains so with us to this day. The Greeks called the first letter alpha, the Romans called it A, and we call it A, a sound it never possessed in Latin. B. The second letter of the alphabet represents a crude house, roughly outlined. After food, shelter is an important consideration, and this fact was expressed by the early alphabet maker. The Greeks, again, were ignorant of the picture and careless or indifferent as to the exact name of the character, and thus 2 triangles instead of the square supporting a triangle were made, and the name changed from Beth to Beta. Combine the Greek names with the first 2 letters, and we have Alpha Beta, alphabet. The Romans shortened the name Beta, calling it Be, and introduced the curved loops. The original name is familiar to us through names found in the Scriptures: Bethel, house of God, and Bethlehem, house of bread. C and G. The ship of the desert, the camel, gave its name to the third letter. Our name for this animal is traceable back to the Phoenician gemel or gamel. The long neck and the peculiar angle of the neck in relation to the head could easily be represented. The Greeks made changes similar to those in other letters. They improved the shape and changed the name to gamma. The Romans did not forget the curve and gave it both the hard and soft sounds, K and Ge. Later on, about the 3rd century A.D., to distinguish the Ge sound from the K sound, they added a little bar below the opening. Thus we get both C and G from the picture of the camel. Stevenson said that when he was a child, the capital G always impressed him as a jenny swooping down to drink out of a handsome cup. Kipling's story of the invention of the alphabet is filled with similar delightful stories of the picture origin of letter forms. D. The next letter D came from a representation of a door, daleth. It probably pictures the door of a tent. A custom that prevails among the Arabs and in a number of countries gave particular importance to the door of a tent. A stranger or even an enemy, if he entered through the door of a tent, must receive food, drink, and shelter. Daleth became delta with the Greeks and de with the Romans, who, of course, rounded the angle. E. The house picture gave us B, the door D, and the window E. Hey meant to look, to see, or window, and one writer asserts our familiar street cry, "Hey there," can be traced to these ancient times. One sidebar of the window was lost early. The Greeks at first used this sound for the long E, epsilon, but afterwards employed the character H, or eta, for the long sound. The Romans at first made no change except to call it E. This is the letter that occurs so frequently in English words, and many, no doubt, recall the interesting use that Poe makes of this fact in his story, The Gold Bug. F. Our letter order does not agree with that of the Phoenicians or the early Greeks. Our sixth letter, F, is missing in classical Greek, but it is found in earlier writings. It comes from a Phoenician representation of a hook, or nail, vow. The Hebrew form resembles the latter object. The nail was important in shipbuilding, a common industry of the early traders. When the Greeks used this letter, they called it digamma, double gamma, and its form represented one gamma, Greek C, superimposed over the other. The Romans called it F, and during the reign of Emperor Claudius, the consonant V was represented by the F inverted. This was done because the Latin alphabet had but one character to represent U and V. Octavia became Octavia, spelled with the inverted F. H. 2 fence posts and 3 horizontal boards gave us our 8th letter, H. The fence was called Haith. The Greeks omitted the upper and lower boards, thus making it like our H, and called it eta. The Romans gave it a soft sound, ha, just as we do today. I and J. The parts of the human body also played an important part in giving form to the letters of the alphabet. The early peoples recognized the value of the hand and the head, and these members gave rise to the letters I and K, and Q and R, respectively. The hand in profile, bent at the knuckles and wrist, gives us the character Yod, the hand, as used by the Phoenicians. The Greeks, who always liked to have their words end in vowels, added A and called it Eota. When the Romans received it, it was simply a vertical stroke, E, which represented the same long E sound as it did with the Greeks, but later they used it both as a consonant and vowel, differentiating the consonant by making the letter I longer, J, but they did not give a distinct letter form for the capital J until the 16th century. The small j came into being nearly a century later. The dot over the I was first introduced in the 13th century manuscript. K. The silhouette of the open hand, with its radiating lines, discloses the origin of the letter K, kaf, which signified hollow or palm. We know that palmistry was practiced by the ancients, and probably the association of reading the hand and writing influenced the inclusion of this character. The Greeks added their favorite vowel sound, a, again, and thus obtained their kappa. The Romans had no need for this letter at first, as C furnished the same sound. When they did accept it, they made no change. L. The ox goad or whiplash, lamed, gave rise to the next letter. Herding oxen and sheep was the important occupation of the slaves of the Phoenicians, and hence the last, an object so unfamiliar to us, was easily recognized by them. The Greeks again added an A and call it lambda, and made it in the form of an inverted V. The Romans, strangely, adhered more closely to the original form than did the Greeks. M and N. The Phoenicians were lovers of the sea, and from this source two letters were derived, M and N. They explored not only all the Mediterranean shore at an early date, but they also sailed boldly through the gates of Gibraltar and beyond the world, where they found Britain. They were the first navigators that sailed by night, and it is said they discovered the North Star. Therefore it is not surprising that water, Maim, is the source of M, and that fish, Noon, the source of N. The letter M has changed but little in form. It is the Greek letter mu and the Roman M. The head of the fish, from which the letter N is pictured, was simplified even more than the head of the ox, in A. It no doubt represents the fisherman's viewpoint, not a swimming fish, but a suspended one. The Greeks reversed the stroke and called it nu, and the Romans did not change its form, but called it N. O. In Phoenicia, as in Egypt, China, and Mexico, the I is one of the commonest elements found in the writing. It was called ayin. The Greeks used it for two sounds, now designated by omicron, little o, and omega, great O, the letter which, strangely, was placed at the end of the Greek alphabet. We find it in the Bible. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. How many today would think of using the alphabet for such an important illustration? It is easy to trace the Roman O from its Greek parent, omicron. P. Many letter pictures run in pairs, finger and hand, water and fish, and now, after I, we find mouth, pi, which represents the lower lip. The Greeks made little change in the name or shape at first, but later they introduced the angles and made the downward strokes equal. The Romans formed the letter by continuing the curve farther than the Phoenicians and called it pe. Q and R. Now we come to Q and R, the letters which were mentioned above as those probably coming from the head. Whether Q, Kopf, was derived from the picture of the back view of the head and neck, or whether it represents a knot, which, no doubt, was as important to navigators then as it is now, is a mooted question. The Q sound is guttural, and the tail of the letter is supposed to indicate the throat sound. The Greeks soon discarded kopa, as it was called, and the Romans went back to the original source of their Q, ko. The back view of the head is the unusual one, for as we look at the drawing of the early races, or memory pictures, or the delineations of a child of 7 or 8, we find that there are almost without exception profile pictures. The Phoenician resh represents the profile and shows very little resemblance to a human being, although at first the features may have been more clearly indicated. The Greeks, as was to be expected, turned the letter around and later, oddly enough, introduced a curve making it exactly like the Roman letter P. The extra stroke which we find in the Roman letter was no doubt due to the carelessness in copying. They pronounced it er. S. There is a common legend explaining S, the letter with the hissing sound. Because of its curved shape and its hissing sound, many people believe it was derived from a snake. Its real history is easily followed from Phoenician shin or sin, meaning teeth, to the present day. Its form closely resembles RW. The Greeks made a perpendicular for their sigma, and the Romans simplified and curved it, giving S. T. Our 20th letter T is particularly interesting because it is derived from tav, a mark or cross made by people who could not write, and no doubt their signature frequently resembled it. We must not forget that even Charlemagne and other kings of the Middle Ages had to make their mark or trace their initials through stencil plates. The only change of tav to Greek tau and Roman te was the raising of the crossbar. U, V, Y. The letters U, V, and Y were all taken from the letter upsilon, and it may have been derived from the queer Hebrew form of ayin, which closely resembles Y. The letters U and V were interchangeable. Upsilon, known as the Samian letter, was used by Pythagoras as an emblem to represent the parting of the ways, the young man making a choice in life. W. Our Anglo-Saxon forefathers contributed two letters, W, when, and another often confused with Y, called thorn. These were introduced during the 13th century. The French always called the former letter W, and in English it may be said to represent W, as its name indicates. The letter thorn had the value of the digraph th and ye in Old English should be pronounced the, like the definite article. X and Z. Although we have no direct need for the letter X, for Z can be substituted for it when it is used as an initial letter, and KS when it is used elsewhere. It has remained in the alphabet since its frequent use by the Greeks. It came from the Roman X, which may have been derived from the Greek kis. The latter resembles the Phoenician character smash, meaning a post or support. The dagger zayin, from which we obtain our Z, must have been important in the daily lives of the Greeks, Hebrews, and Phoenicians, for it occupies the 6th place, zeta, and the 7th in the later alphabets. The Romans did not change its name or shape, but although there has been little change in 2,000 years, we see little resemblance to the short sword in the letter the Romans gave us. Many slight changes that have occurred in the formation of the letters of the alphabet may be accounted for. At first, the Greeks wrote from left to right in one line, and from right to left on the next line, a mode of writing which has been termed boustrophodon because it runs as an ox plow does in a field, up one furrow and down another. It is due to this fact that many letters were reversed from the original prototypes. It is interesting to note that recently books for the blind have been embossed in this manner. The small letters of the alphabet, sometimes called lowercase letters because printers kept them in a case below the capitals, or minuscule letters, in contrast with majuscule or capital letters, illustrate further changes due to rapid writing of capitals in a cursive or running hand. The few characters selected by the Phoenicians, the great traders, artificers, and farmers of the ancient world, not only influenced Greek literature and life, Roman and modern nations in Europe, but also spread eastward to the very walls of China. The Hebrews copied them as a whole and retained the original names with only slight variations. They did change the shapes because a different writing instrument was employed. According to a legend, Jehovah gave the letters to Moses. Hence all the left curves in Hebrew letter form turn upward as symbols of a finger pointing heavenward. The Phoenician alphabet is also the parent of Arabic, Indian, Javanese, Korean, Tibetan, Coptic syllabaries, and alphabets. No small country ever gave such a great gift to humanity. No large country could have given a greater gift. End of The Story of the Alphabet by Otto F. Egg.
Table of Different Velocities Expressed in Meters per Second by James Jackson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Abai in May 2020. Table of Different Velocities Expressed in Meters per Second. The following table has been drawn up by Mr. James Jackson, librarian to the Paris Geographical Society. A man walking 4 kilometers an hour, 1.11 meters per second. A man walking 5 kilometers an hour, 1.40 meters per second. The comet of Halley in aphelion, 3.25 meters per second. A ship going 9 knots an hour, 9 times 1,852 meters, 4.63 meters per second. Ordinary wind, from 5 to 6 meters per second. A ship going 12 knots an hour, 12 times 1,852 meters, 6.17 meters per second. A wave 30 meters in magnitude with a depth of 300 meters, 6.81 meters per second. A ship going 17 knots an hour, 17 times 1,852 meters, 8.75 meters per second. A fresh breeze, 10 meters per second. A torpedo boat going 21 knots an hour, 21 times 1,852 meters, 10.80 meters per second. A racehorse trotting an English mile in 2 minutes 14 seconds, 12 meters per second. A racehorse galloping 900 meters a minute, 15 meters per second. An express train running 60 kilometers per hour, 16.67 meters per second. Flight of a falcon or a carrier pigeon, 18 meters per second. A wave in a tempest at sea, 21.85 meters per second. An express train running 60 English miles an hour, 60 times 1,609 meters, 26.81 meters per second. A tempest, from 25 to 30 meters a second. The transmission of sensation by human nerves, 33 meters per second. A hurricane, 40 meters per second. Flight of one of the swiftest birds, 88.90 meters per second. Velocity of a point on the equator of Mercury, 146.87 meters per second. Propagation of the tide caused by the earthquake of Africa on August 13, 1868, Africa to Honolulu, according to Hochstetter, 227.38 meters per second. Velocity of a point on the equator of Mars, 244 meters per second. Velocity of sound in the air at plus 10 degrees Celsius, 337.20 meters per second. Velocity of a point on the equator of Venus, 454.58 meters per second. Velocity of a point on the equator of the Earth, 463 meters per second. A cannonball, 500 meters per second. Propagation of the movement of tides, North Pacific Ocean, maximum according to Whewell, 922 meters per second. The moon's revolution round the Earth, 1012 meters per second. Velocity of a point on the equator of Mercury, 1034 meters per second. Revolution of the second satellite of Mars, 1157 meters per second. Concussion of the earthquake of Liège, July 25, 1855, from Turin to Geneva in 126 seconds, 1,368 meters per second. Velocity of sound in water at plus 8.1 degrees Celsius, 1,435 meters per second. Revolution of the first satellite of Mars, 1,833 meters per second. Velocity of a point on the equator of the Sun, 2,028 meters per second. Revolution of the fourth satellite of Uranus, 3,300 meters per second. Revolution of the eighth satellite of Saturn, 3,738 meters per second. Revolution of the third satellite of Uranus, 3,814 meters per second. Velocity of a point on the equator of Uranus, 3,904 meters per second. Revolution of the satellite of Neptune, 4,505 meters per second. Revolution of the second satellite of Uranus, 4,906 meters per second. Revolution of Neptune round the Sun, 5,390 meters per second. Revolution of the first satellite of Uranus, 5,763 meters per second. Revolution of the seventh satellite of Saturn, 5,794 meters per second. Revolution of the sixth satellite of Saturn, 6,398 meters per second. Revolution of Uranus round the Sun, 6,730 meters per second. Proper movement of Vega, 7,000 meters per second. Displacement of the Sun towards the constellation of Hercules, 7,642 meters per second. Revolution of the fourth satellite of Jupiter, 8,359 meters per second. Revolution of Saturn round the Sun, 9,584 meters per second. Revolution of the fifth satellite of Saturn, 9,741 meters per second. Velocity of a point on the equator of Saturn, 10,541 meters per second. Revolution of the third satellite of Jupiter, 10,869 meters per second. Revolution of the fourth satellite of Saturn, 11,516 meters per second. Velocity of a point on the equator of Jupiter, 12,491 meters per second. Revolution of Jupiter round the Sun, 12,924 meters per second. Revolution of the third satellite of Saturn, 13,038 meters per second. Revolution of the second satellite of Jupiter, 13,999 meters per second. Revolution of the second satellite of Saturn, 14,568 meters per second. Revolution of the first satellite of Saturn, 16,429 meters per second. Revolution of the first satellite of Jupiter, 17,667 meters per second. Revolution of Mars round the Sun, 23,863 meters per second. Revolution of the Earth round the Sun, 29,516 meters per second. Revolution of Venus round the Sun, 34,630 meters per second. Proper movement of Capella, 40,000 meters per second. Revolution of Mercury round the Sun, 47,327 meters per second. Proper movement of Sirius, 51,000 meters per second. Ordinary movements of the solar atmosphere, from 30,000 to 65,000 meters per second. Proper movement of the 61st of Cygnus, 71,600 meters per second. Proper movement of Arcturus, 85,000 meters per second. The comet of Halley in perihelion, 393,260 meters per second. Tempests of the solar atmosphere, 402,000 meters per second. Electricity, a telegraphic submarine wire, 4 million meters per second. Electricity, a telegraphic aerial wire, 36 million meters per second. Velocity of light, 300,400,000 meters per second. End of Table of Different Velocities Expressed in Meters per Second by James Jackson, from Nature, October 18, 1883.
Water Music by Aldous Huxley, read by Daniel Davison. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Water music. The house in which I live is haunted by the noise of dripping water. Always, day and night, summer and winter, something is dripping somewhere. For many months an unquiet cistern kept up within its iron bosom a long, hollow-toned soliloquy. Now it is mute, but a new and more formidable drip has come into existence. From the very summit of the house a little spout, the overflow, no doubt, of some unknown receptacle under the roof, lets fall a succession of drops that is almost a continuous stream. Down it falls, this all but stream, a sheer 40 or 50 feet onto the stones of the basement steps, thence to dribble ignominiously away into some appointed drain. The cataracts blow their trumpets from the steep, but my lesser waterfalls play subtler, I had almost said a more modern music. Lying awake at nights, I listen with a mixture of pleasure and irritation to its curious cadences. The musical range of a dripping tap is about half an octave, but within the bounds of this major fourth, drops can play the most surprising and varied melodies. You will hear them climbing laboriously up small degrees of sound, only to descend at a single leap to the bottom. More often they wander unaccountably about in varying intervals, familiar or disconcertingly odd. And with the varying pitch, the time also varies, but within narrow limits. For the laws of hydrostatics, or whatever other science claims authority over drops, do not allow the dribblings much license either to pause or to quicken the pace of their falling. It is an odd sort of music. One listens to it as one lies in bed, slipping gradually into sleep with a curious uneasy emotion. Drip, drop, drip, drap, drip, drop, so it goes on, this watery melody, forever without an end, inconclusive, inconsistent, formless. It is always on the point of deviating into sense and form. Every now and then you will hear a complete phrase of rounded melody, and then drip, drop, de-drip, de-drap. The old inconsequence sets in once more. But suppose there were some significance in it. It is that which troubles my drowsy mind as I listen at night. Perhaps for those who have ears to hear, this endless dribbling is as pregnant with thought and emotion, as significant as a piece of Bach. Drip, drop, de-drap, de-drap. So little would suffice to turn the incoherence into meaning. The music of the drops is the symbol and type of the whole universe. It is forever, as it were, asymptotic to sense, infinitely close to significance, but never touching it. Never unless the human mind comes and pulls it forcibly over the dividing space. If I could understand this wandering music, if I could detect in it a sequence, if I could force it to some conclusion, the diapason closing full in God, in mind, I hardly care what, so long as it closes in something definite, then I feel I should understand the whole incomprehensible machine, from the gaps between the stars to the policy of the Allies. And growing drowsier and drowsier, I listen to the ceaseless tune, the hollow soliloquy in the cistern, the sharp metallic rapping of the drops that fall from the roof upon the stones below. And surely I begin to discover a meaning. Surely I detect a trace of thought. Surely the phrases follow one another with art, leading on inevitably to some prodigious conclusion. Almost I have it. Almost. Almost. Then I suppose I fall definitely to sleep. For the next thing I am aware of is that the sunlight is streaming in. It is morning, and the water is still dripping as irritatingly and persistently as ever. Sometimes the incoherence of the drop music is too much to be borne. The listener insists that the asymptote shall somehow touch the line of sense. He forces the drops to say something. He demands of them that they shall play, shall we say, God Save the Queen, or the Hymn to Joy from the Ninth Symphony, or Voi che sapete. The drops obey reluctantly. They play what you desire, but with more than the ineptitude of the child at the piano. Still, they play it somehow. But this is an extremely dangerous method of laying the haunting ghost whose voice is the drip of water. For once you have given the drops something to sing or say, they will go on singing and saying it forever. Sleep becomes impossible, and at the 200 or 300th repetition of Madelon, or even of an air from Figaro, the mind begins to totter towards insanity. Drops, ticking clocks, machinery, everything that throbs or clicks or hums or hammers can be made with a little perseverance to say something. In my childhood, I remember I was told that trains said, to Lancashire, to fetch a pocket handkerchief, and a capo ad infinitum. They can also repeat, if desired, that useful piece of information, to stop the train, pull down the chain. But it is very hard to persuade them to add the menacing corollary penalty for improper use, £5. Still, with careful tutoring, I have succeeded in teaching a train to repeat even that unrhythmical phrase. Dadaist literature always reminds me a little of my falling drops. Confronted by it, I feel the same uncomfortable emotion as is begotten in me by the inconsequent music of water. Suppose, after all, that this apparently accidental sequence of words should contain the secret of art and life and the universe. It may, who knows? And here am I, left out in the cold of total incomprehension, and I pore over this literature and regard it upside down in the hope of discovering that secret, but somehow I cannot induce the words to take on any meaning whatever. Drip, drop, de-drap, de-drep. Sara and Pecabia let fall their words, and I am baffled. But I can see that there are great possibilities in this type of literature. For the tired journalist it is ideal, since it is not he, but the reader who has to do all the work. All he need do is to lean back in his chair and allow the words to dribble out through the nozzle of his fountain pen. Drip, drop. End of Water Music by Aldous Huxley.